I don't feel like Steve Martin has ever really spoken to me. I like his banjo playing, but I just can't think of any of his movies, so I'm like, I gotta watch
It's
it.
okay now.
No, he is, for sure.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority Board of Directors meeting. It is Thursday, August 17th, and we do have a quorum. First on our agenda is to approve the agenda on opening items. Are there any changes? Mike and I just talked. Let's see, item number 6.2, asset protection. He's going to discuss it at the same time that he gives the monitoring task force update, if that's all right with everyone. Are there any other agenda changes or needs? With that change in mind, would somebody like to make a motion to approve?
I'll move.
Okay, seconded by Kyra. All in favor, raise your hands. Thank you so much. That passed unanimously. Next is 1.2, public comment. I see we have someone in the theater, so go ahead, Robert.
I don't want to impede on the presentation over here. Good evening. My name is Robert Pulowski. I'm the Vice Chair for the Regional Transit Authority Citizens Advisory Committee, and I'm from Southgate, Wayne County. As requested, I am following up on a brief email, but also giving you a little public feedback on the Title VI presentation that was presented last month. I know this month it's a discussion on one of the agenda items, and I wanted to briefly give you some of my thoughts and input on that for the CEO, but also Forrest as well. For most agencies to start with, public feedback up to, with complaints, 180 days. That's actually pretty good. In my opinion, if you look at other agencies, for example, we're going to use Myrtle Beach. Just for great reference, I just got back from town from Myrtle Beach, and their transit system is a little bit different than more than Ann Arbor's. They have a college, they have community colleges, they have schools, they have businesses, they have development. Unlike Ann Arbor has much more demand than most of these regions. 180 days for a region like this with the amount of service that we have is very exciting, but also it gives back to the customer if they have an issue long-term and they want to report that. Discrimination cases, which is also something that really stuck out in my mind. Discrimination against an employee or a rider in specifically is something that should not be tolerated within an agency. I'd like to see other agencies take up on this, SMART and DDOT. I hope you're listening to this. Being able to follow up with that complainant if an issue like that occurs is just the beginning. And I'm in full support of that because we have a hatred in our country where we see a lot of discrimination, whether that's public transit or that's public schools. You know, the more we address it, the more we as a company thrive to be able to attract all walks of life within our business, whether that's a government operation or a business. Did have a few other things. Rider surveys, following on the 2022 public engagement for the rider surveys is one thing that is critical. Being able to address and get out to the public on more survey occasions, but getting that public feedback. I know LaTanya and most of the LAC have done their due diligence to be able to pull that input and rider feedback from most occasions, but what needs to be included is we need more rider input. We need more people getting out on the buses taking input instead of QR codes.
You have 1 minute left.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's a lot of people that don't use a smartphone. Most of Ann Arbor uses it. We have college students, we have high school students, we have millennials, we have baby boomers that still use cell phones, but we also got to be reminded about the seniors and people with disabilities that do not use cell phones. So once a year, at least getting out to have that input from riders really makes a difference. MUS and our organization have done that, and we have succeeded, and we have gathered so much input, we can't even keep count. It's something to think about going into next year long-term if we want to see a system thrive. In terms of expanding service, that does include in the Title VI, but more likely the expanded service that was proposed with the 2045 does go hand in hand with this Title VI. So I'm very happy to see that included and being able to look forward into the future as always. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Deb, do we have anyone online who'd like to join in for public comment? She does not. That will close public comment, and we will move on to general announcements. I have a couple. The first is a reminder that the Governance Procurement Task Force will be assembling very soon. We still only have 2 members. I really would need a third one. I will be sending out an email again. So if you can, I know that it's a tight time of year, but please consider volunteering if you're able. The second thing on my list is to remind everyone that in September, it is the board members' elections will be held at the top of the meeting. And so that's something for you to think about and consider. If you would like to run for office, the 3 officers are secretary, treasurer, and board chair. Secretary is currently Mr. Miller. Treasurer is currently Mr. Alamang, and then myself as chair. And then finally, I wanted to get back with you on something that happened last month. We had we took a vote because we weren't sure what to do when we were represented with a reworking of a policy that was actually presented to us live. And I took that opportunity to go back through past board meetings because I just didn't remember it, and I felt like I was doing you all disservice because I was like, what do we do? In the past, the reason why it felt so strange to me is in the past, we used to just put any new updates from non-compliance or whatever actually in the consent agenda. So we, in effect, that's how it got voted on. So if we're gonna pull it out like that and again in the future, it is prudent for us to actually vote on that. And then finally, I don't have any other announcements, but I'm wondering if anyone else has an announcement or two. Okay, then seeing none, we'll close that out and we'll move on to the consent agenda. There was a caveat with the consent agenda. The governance committee packet was, the governance committee draft notes was not the final draft, and so a copy was sent to you all via email today. I'm hoping you had a chance to read it. It was just some minor alterations and changes to what was already there. And if you need a hard copy, Deb has also brought them. Knowing that, do I have any concerns, or would someone like to go ahead and make a motion to approve the consent agenda as it stands with the new draft final?
I move we approve the
Okay, Jesse's going to move and Mike is going to second. Any discussion? None. We'll go ahead and vote. All in favor, say aye. Okay, thank you so much. That passed unanimously. There are no special items that I am aware of. So we are going to move on to ownership linkage. As you may see, Mr. Chang is not available to us this evening, but he was kind enough to send off a quick report. And if you'll indulge me, I'll read that for him. He says that they met with Mayor Taylor and had a really good dialogue and very helpful input. Number 2, the task force met to recap the meeting. One of the big thoughts that came out of this is a discussion for the entire board. Whose role is advocacy? Staff, board, both, and how? And where is the line between individual advocacy and board holism? Something for us to make sure is part of our board work plan, so probably a discussion in December when we talk about plan of work for next year. Finally, he said their next steps are to make minor revisions to the presentation deck that they made to make it even better, provide suggested approaches, and continue discussions over email with Mayor Taylor about timing and method to perform outreach with him and City Council, and that would be the ownership open dialogue task force. And then finally, next on their agenda is to schedule a meeting with Mayor of Ypsilanti, that would be Mayor Brown. And that is his final report. But I would like to open it up to the task force. If Rich may have missed anything, or you'd like to color some more lines in for us, it's open. Okay, seeing none, then we will move on. And next on the list is the monitoring task force update. That is Mr. Mike Alamang.
Okay, thank you. Board members may remember that in the past, we've discussed two monitoring reports that contain policies that are somewhat ambiguous and perhaps even overlapping and maybe in the wrong place and seemed redundant and so forth. Specifically, what I'm talking about is in 2.5, which is financial conditions and activities. The sub-policy 2.5.3 says the CEO shall not receive, process, or disperse funds under controls insufficient to meet auditor standards, okay? That's financial conditions and activities. 2.7 is asset protection, has a very similar wording. 2.7.2.1, which is receive, process, or disperse assets under internal controls insufficient to detect or deter or prevent fraud, or insufficient to prevent or detect deficiencies or material weaknesses. Pretty much similar. One, however, brings in the auditors. Had discussions about this in the past. We had more discussions at the last monitoring task force and decided that Rose Mercier was actually going to look at these two. Also, she brought up the fact that that there had been some modifications to one of these policies a year ago, and maybe the modifications didn't really fit the template for policy governance. So she was going to review both of these in light of that and bring it back to the committee or to the task force to discuss next time. We also talked about what to do when there are comments that are made by board members when they're reviewing monitoring reports that are particularly relate to what might be some changes in the actual wording for policies. And most monitoring reports have some comments that may involve things like that. And so what we decided is probably the best way to handle that is going forward when the board is reviewing and voting on a monitoring report and seeing what comments were made by the board on any particular policy or sub-policy that might involve changing the actual wording of a policy, that the board chair would, if appropriate, make a motion to send that particular issue to the whatever committee it came from to review and make a recommendation on whether there should be any change to the wording in the policy, and if so, what that might be. The third thing we talked about, as opposed to individual wording changes that come out in the monitoring reports, is if you recall, the monitoring task force resolved and discussed here with the board, and I believe the board approved, having 2 to 3 overall reviews of individual policies during a year. And what we decided is that it's probably more appropriate for the governance committee to make that decision on what would be recommending in terms of overall policy review. And the governance committee would be doing that going forward. The monitoring task force, when they came up with that particular way to handle monitoring reports and specifically the review of overall review of policies, we made the recommendation at that time, but going forward, we think it's really more appropriate for the governance committee starting next fiscal year. So you heard what I said about 2.5 and 2.7, and that's why Kathleen at the beginning of the meeting said that 2.5 is not on the agenda tonight. So does anybody have any questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We appreciate it. Thank you, Mike. We appreciate that. Next on the agenda is the quarterly 3 financial report, and that's Ms. Dina Reed.
Thank you. You have the Q3 financial report in your packet. It was reviewed at the Finance Committee on August 8th. We had good discussion there. We went through the income statement, balance sheet, investments, and good discussion about cash flow. Generally speaking, our revenues and expenses are trending pretty close to budget. We are in the same surplus position we thought we would be at the end of Q3. There are some key variances as we go through the year, which is typical. One big variance that you might see on the revenue side is that we're under budget in terms of federal operating assistance. And that's consistent with our strategy of reducing the reliance on that as much as possible. We did not make a full commitment to pull back completely on that until we start receiving the new millage funds. But until that time, we budgeted that we would use it if we needed it, but if we don't, we won't. So far this year, we have not had to dip into the 5307 funds. So that's why it's showing unfavorable, but actually that's kind of a good thing because it means that we're not using the 5307 money for operating. In terms of expense, we're pretty much running favorable in all categories on some level. There's one unfavorable category, and that's really just a part of using more contractual services this year because we're understaffed in some areas. So when you can see there's an offset with the savings in salaries, wages, and benefits, and then we're running over budget on some of the contractual services, but we're well within our operating budget as expected. Another note I'd like to make about the financial report is the federal pandemic relief utilization. We continue to use that through the year as expected. And if you may recall, that for fiscal year 23, we budgeted that we would have over $11 million surplus. However, as you'll hear through the budget presentation for the fiscal year 2024 budget presentation, we are likely to start pulling back on using some of those funds in fourth quarter of this fiscal year. However, to date, we have used them fully to the extent that we're able to. So that's just looking forward. And so I'd note that just underneath the income statement, it talks about federal pandemic relief fund utilization. And at the end of Q3, we have $8.6 million left to use. And that's it. That will exhaust all of the federal pandemic relief funds. So we're going to be utilizing that as efficiently as possible and finishing that out over the course of the next few quarters. Looking over on the balance sheet, assets and liabilities are stable and strong. Our reserve targets are continued to be met and above the 2.5 minimum reserve target. Capital reserves are increasing as expected as we continue to have surpluses from the use of pandemic relief funds. And cash flow has stabilized in the third quarter. In the first 2 quarters, we had some timing issues there because we were understaffed. We've caught back up, and now we're pretty much stabilized in Q3 where we would expect to be in terms of cash flow. There's been no issue with cash flow at all through the year. It's just a matter of timing of payables and receivables and things like that. Another good news is under investment summary, you can see that as our treasury notes and agency bonds mature, we're able to invest in higher interest rate agency bonds and treasury notes. That's the same strategy we've always used. It's just the interest rates are going up, and we're being very deliberate to make sure that those get into maturities at a time when we'll need the funds, as well as take advantage of the highest interest rate possible at the time that we have those funds to invest. That concludes the summary of the report. I'm happy to answer any questions.
It's open for the board if anyone has any questions for Dina. Mike?
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to make a couple of comments. First of all, I want to reinforce Dina's, what her overall message was, and that we are in good financial shape. We really are. We're fortunate still to have pandemic funds that will be utilizing. And obviously, next year, we will start having more revenue from our millage, which will be nice, obviously, too. Dina also mentioned that some investments matured and were reinvested at a higher rate. In case you don't have that schedule in front of you, let me mention what those rates were. Treasury notes matured that were paying 0.13%. Does those interest rates sound familiar to anybody? But now they were reinvested at 5.5%. So yes, interest rates have been going up, in case you hadn't noticed.
Good news for us.
On one hand.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Dina Reed. We're going to move on. The next on our agenda is policy 6.1, the sustainability policy by Mr. Simi Bar and Ms. Susan Palais.
Thank you. Hey all, so we're back again talking about sustainability policy. It's the third time at this point, so I'll keep it very brief. But a few of the board members, myself, Susan and Liz had worked on sustainability language and had brought it to our last two meetings due to some miscommunications, partially on me. Our policy governance consultant hadn't had a chance to actually see the language until our last meeting, so we delayed it. And had a bit of back and forth in the meantime, and were able to work out some of the issues. The main one being was the location of the proposed language. Really ends probably wasn't the best place to propose that for. So it's a learning experience for us on the board. So thank you for sticking with me and us as we move through this. And happy to say the language that's now here in the board packet has been seen by the task force, the CEO, and the governance advisor, and everybody's okayed that to get it in front of the board. So as Rose did some research, she found some sustainability policies that were a little more extensive. Susan and I had gone back and forth about the depth we really wanted to get with here, and had some varying opinions. So we actually brought two options to the board, one with a bit more depth and one that's not quite as extensive. So the first is a simple carbon neutrality statement, similar to what we've seen at the last two board meetings. All we're proposing is it to be in a different location. The second is a little more detailed. It's calling for environmental sustainability, a bit more sort of broad of a term, and then the four sub policies dive in a little bit more. The second actually hitting specifically on carbon neutrality. These four sub policies are likely things that would be addressed even if we just adopted the option number one. They're sort of encompassed into carbon neutrality largely, so they'd likely be touched on either way. And as I've considered our options, I think I've been swayed towards preferring option number two, going with a bit more depth up front. Seeing as written policies, basically one of the best ways for us to really monitor the organization and understand what's going on. I think I favor, going with a little more, written policy up front, and then, we can make modifications if needed down the line. So at this point, I want to see if there's discussion, questions about the language that's presented here, or preference between either of the options presented here. And my thought would be, in terms of sort of voting and motioning, since the option one is sort of contained within option two, my thought would be to motion for a vote on option two first. If that was not to pass, I'd motion for a vote on option one and see what happens there. So with that, happy to discuss and answer questions.
Thank you, Simi. I was wondering if, before we open up to more questions, Susan, Simi gave a really good argument with his thoughts on the different options, and I would like to hear what your thoughts are.
Am I on? Oh, here we go. Okay. My own thoughts are in alignment with Simi. We had begun with carbon neutrality. It's something we've brought forward to the board. I'm very comfortable if that's where the board decides to go. Really, as was described, what we've done is just relocate where we're proposing it would fit. Personally, I would find it more comfortable if we were more explicit as a board on what we would hope, what we want to see. But again, if that's too high a hurdle for the board, again, I'd be comfortable going back with just the first one, because that's what we had brought forward in June and again in July. Again, the goal of the detail is to help for the reporting that comes, but it really is not meant to be a hurdle to approval tonight.
And with that, we're going to open up the floor for questions. I see Mike.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Susan, and you, Simi, for coming up with this. I think this is, I complimented you at the last board meeting. I will compliment you again. It's really great that you took the initiative to come up with a policy that I think is something that really, something that it is very important for AATA to have. Looking at the two options, to me, the second one seems more appealing. Among various reasons, I would think, when looking ahead to when actually the monitoring report is submitted by Mr. Carpenter, this I would think would help him in terms of his interpretation of the policy. And I just wanted to see if he felt the same way about that.
Good question. Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you. I was happy to be involved in the most recent discussion. I thought it was very fruitful. I have no concerns with either version of this. I think both of them are very appropriate as executive limitations policies. I've already begun sort of hammering out what an interpretation and evidence might look like. A little ways to go. I don't have anything tonight. I do think, as Simi said, the specificity of option 2 is going to come out in an interpretation anyway. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for the board if they want to drill down to this level in your expectations. It's entirely up to you. But I don't foresee, Mike, to your question, I don't foresee any problem coming up with interpretations for either option.
Anybody else?
Thank you. And also, I really do appreciate the work that you've put into this. I really like this as an executive limitation. As much as I think the ends are a statement of our purpose, I think this actually will be, my feeling is that it's going to have a more direct impact on how the agency runs as an executive limitation. So I feel actually, as much as I was prepared to vote in favor of the end last month, I like this even more. So thank you. I actually did have a couple of questions. First, I favor the second for specificity, and also I like that you talked about other environmental issues beyond just carbon neutrality. With this pressing an issue, and as carbon neutrality is, I'm glad that we're also stating, that we're wanting to, in general, minimize harmful ecological impacts and waste. There are other things than carbon neutrality, and I like that this calls those out. With that said, I have two questions. In comparing the two policies, the top one says organizational practices, whereas the second one says organizational practices or activities. And I was wondering what what was the motivation behind that? And I also wanted to, I was hoping that you could speak to what you saw as the practical differences between points 1 and 2 under option 2.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. As far as organizational practices versus practices or activities, I don't think I can speak too specifically to the language choices. I think it was pretty innocuous that that change was in there. As far as between 1 and 2, in option 2, I think the big one is what you had sort of mentioned about impacts beyond carbon neutrality. So air pollutants being a big one. So obviously there are a whole numerous air pollutants and some harmful to human health and all sorts of negative associations there. So I would say that is the biggest, though they are, they have similarities, obviously.
Susan?
For me, everything you just said to me, and I would add with activities, it expands itself from regular operations to include things like a broader statement around construction, which are once in a lifetime things, where we're striving with our projects to pursue the goals of the agency, but in the way that also meets this goal. So again, it's not an ongoing practice, but rather these are sort of one-off projects.
Thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions? I do have one. It's in the option 2, and it's number 2, and it says allow organizational operations that are inconsistent with the achievement of carbon neutrality. I'm wondering, what does this mean in the long term in terms of hardlining? Because I would not, while I do agree that carbon neutrality is a very important issue for our world and for our city and for our people, I also understand that we have a lot of other initiatives, ridership and things like that. We have a lot of services that we're putting into play. And I'm worried that this language might supersede those initiatives, or maybe I'm reading it wrong. And I would like to ask Rose Mercier, who, for the public who doesn't know, she's our governance coach and she's popped in on our meeting with us. Am I just interpreting that incorrectly, that it doesn't supersede anything else? Like if we miss an organizational opportunity to not be carbon neutral because we had to do something else, are we then going to say, oh, we failed?
Yeah, I wouldn't interpret it in that way. I think, and Simi and Susan could probably correct me if I get off track, but what I read that as saying is it's inconsistent with the achievement of. It doesn't say you must achieve, right? So I think that's, if you're worried that it's kind of saying this has to be the primary goal, what it's saying, I take this to say is that what you don't want to be doing are doing things that are inconsistent with the ability to achieve, or the, with achieving carbon neutrality. It doesn't say, I'll just stop there. That's
Thank you.
because I think also the reasonable interpretation, I mean, that when the CEO interprets this, I think it'll talk about what that looks like operationally, and what there's a measure and how we're going to look at that. And it may be that, carbon neutrality is a ways out, but that there's a way of, if you will, sort of measuring the degree to which the agency is actually getting closer. So no, I don't think it presents the kind of challenge that I understand you to be talking about, Kathleen.
Thank you. That helped me a lot. Are there any other questions? Yes, Mike.
I just have a suggestion, because one of the recommendations is to delete ends 1.2.2 because it's redundant. I just believe it should be part of that motion so that we take care of that at the same time. Maybe it'd be a good idea to read it. I don't have it in front of me.
That's a really good point, Mike, because that was something else I wasn't sure if we were going to wrap it all in together or if we were going to talk about the recommendations afterwards. The only concern I have with removing 1.2.2, it says that it's redundant, but then a lot of our ends are redundant. So in other words, we have people with economic challenges have affordable public transportation options, but that's also under how we address our fare policy. So does that make that redundant? So I like it being under the ends as sort of we're keeping our eye on the prize. I'm not married to it, but I just wanted to play devil's advocate that there are other ends that are a little bit redundant with the executive limitations, but they are aspirational and things that we want. It's our mission, it's our goal. But again, I'm not married to it either way, and I like your suggestion, Mike. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that? Yes, Jesse.
One, I think given what you said, I would prefer to treat this as two separate motions, one as a motion to, to amend our executive limitations, and then have a separate motion to decide whether or not we want to edit the ends. I think that'll help keep that process cleaner. That said, I am in favor of removing the end because I really think this, like we exist, the right exists to provide public transportation. And the way in which we do that falls more under executive limitations. We do not exist to be a carbon neutral entity. We want to be a carbon neutral entity that provides public transportation. So yes, it is redundant, but I also think it's just, it's not an end. It's not the reason that we exist. We do not exist to be carbon neutral, so.
Fair point. Are there any other comments or discussions? I think that, Simi, we might be ready for that motion.
Great, thanks, everyone. Well, I would move that the board adopt the proposed policy option number 2 as a new section in the executive limitations entitled Environmental Sustainability.
Do I have a second? That would be Susan. Good job. All in favor, please raise your hands. And that passed unanimously. Thank you, everyone. Jesse, I believe you recommended a second motion? Or would you like to make it, Simi, or it doesn't matter?
Sure, I'd move that the board remove policy 1.2.2 from the board policy manual. That is public transportation options, minimize energy use and pollution, and conserve natural resources.
And I saw Chris raise his hand to second, or did you have a question? Second, okay. Any discussion on the motion? Okay, all those in favor, raise your hands. And that also passed unanimously. Very good, everyone. Thank you again to the committee, for the task force. Thank you, Rose, for your guidance and for popping in tonight.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I'm sorry, one small procedural matter. There was one other thing here about when it would be monitored and by which committee. We didn't discuss that directly. Either you can all kind of tell me that that's what you meant in that first motion, or a third vote. It amends the policy manual, so I can't, I need your direction.
Yes, thank you very much for pointing that out, Matt.
I move that this new policy 2.11 be monitored annually in April by the service committee.
Seconded by Susan. No, any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor, raise your hands. And that also passed unanimously. Thank you again, everyone, for all your hard work. Next on our agenda is operational updates, and that would be the business plan update by Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Last month, we had some really good feedback on the annual business plan, and I took that opportunity to make some updates in the context and the presentation of the business plan. It's important because the business plan drives the annual budget. I can reassure you and our finance staff that we didn't change any of the projects per se, although I did clarify one particular instance that I'll come to in a moment. But mostly it was about contextualizing and clarifying the pursuit of ridership as one of our number one focuses. we have a lot of things in your ends, and it is your ends policies that drive the purpose of the organization and the starting point for staff in developing any strategic plan. In your highest ends policy, you very clearly say an increasing proportion of people will use public transit options. So that really drives our ridership focus. But then you have a lot of other ends that talk about social equity, environmental improvements, labor mobility, customer satisfaction, and sort of public credibility. In many ways, those things are either driven by ridership or are kind of a result of doing a good job in that space. It's not a perfect fit. There are important nuances there. We're not going to overlook them. But some good comment last month really led me to think I could do a better job at focusing the business plan in that space. A couple of key things that were changed, just as a quick note for you and anyone looking at home. On page 7, you can see just one example of a couple of graphs about ridership that were added. This is straight out of our ends report and looks at rides per capita. This is a way for us to measure ridership divided by our service area population, which is roughly equivalent to an urbanized area, not a metropolitan statistical area. It's 240,000 people-ish. That allows us to track a rate over time as the population comes and goes, because you did say an increasing proportion of residents use transit, so that implies a fraction. And it also allows us to benchmark, so we can do apples to apples with other communities, and you see some examples there on page 7. So I think the other thing I would point to on page 14 is a table outlining a bit more of our strategic alignment, our goals derived from your ends, and the general tactics that we're using, not just this year, some of these extend over multiple years, to pursue the goal of increasing ridership. They're basically organized under attracting new riders and more trips from our current riders, retaining riders with excellence in service delivery, that's our customer satisfaction goal, and then a variety of continuous improvement functions as well. We have a lot of supporting functions within the organization that support the people who deliver that frontline service. So a lot of internal practices that need to be looked at periodically and improved from time to time. There are a lot of things in here that drive ridership. I think the most important ones are they're all in our work plan in one place or another, but the most important ones are higher frequencies of service. That frequency equals freedom is something we've talked about here in the past. Might be worth talking about again, the whole ridership versus coverage concept, but that frequency of service really allows people to make a trip without having to consult the timetable. And that's kind of a psychological thing that makes a big difference for a lot of folks in choosing when and how to travel. The quality of our service, customer satisfaction, nuts and bolts stuff, how clean is it? Is it on time? Were our drivers courteous? How easy was the information to get to? A lot of that sort of stuff. There's always areas we can learn from and do better in that space. And then finally, I think a lot of things having to do with advocacy, and that's something we've talked about in the past. We haven't had time to develop that tool specifically yet, but things like as we have engaging with the city of Ann Arbor on their T1 zoning for higher densities and mixed uses, and perhaps going further in terms of, there's more talk nowadays about road pricing. You hear this as the gas tax becomes less and less effective at generating revenue because of electric cars to fix our roads. Eventually, that thing's going to break, and something will have come in to replace it. I think we have an opportunity there as an industry. So a lot of tactics in here. The following pages go into a little more detail about the things and the projects and initiatives that we're pursuing in pursuit of those goals in 5-year chunks. We have a 5-year work plan, a 10-year capital plan in here. We did share these with committees and board members. I got some excellent feedback along the way. It led to a couple of changes in the draft as it progressed through this month to the version you have here. A couple of the key thoughts that I heard from you that I thought were important mentioning here. In pursuing ridership, we've sort of identified that, there's a difference between what we might call our captive market, folks who need to use transit, and what we might call discretionary riders, those who have a car and maybe have a choice about how they travel. We want to grow our ridership in both cases. I want to be very clear about that. But we had a good discussion in the service committee, essentially boiling down to, in the pursuit of affluent riders, would we neglect our low-income riders? And I just want to be as clear as I can. The answer there is no, never. We have a very important social mission. It's identified in your ends. We want to grow both. They will require slightly different tactics, but I do think a lot of the things like increasing service frequency that will help us attract folks who have an option will also benefit those who do not very directly. So I think there's a good overlap there. That we may choose to adjust fares to benefit both groups is very much a possibility. So we don't want to discount that. Another thing we heard is, where's the emphasis on marketing and advocacy? It's very much an intent. It's very much a tactic we intend to pursue. For me, it's just jammed up behind a staff recruitment challenge that we're still working on. But as soon as I get that position filled, that is something I do want to work on, because I do think there's a lot of opportunity to leverage our advertising, maybe target and focus on certain demographic markets a bit more directly, and look for opportunities to simply sell the product, if you will. So I've added something into the work plan to be a little more specific that is coming, but it is sort of jammed up behind a recruitment challenge. And then lastly, a question, and I think it's a good question. How sure are we or confident our staff in ridership forecasts in general? We have them in our long-range plan, and you see that in the business plan. Short answer is pretty confident, as confident as you can be about what is essentially a prediction about the future. If you had asked me in 2019, how likely is it to have a global pandemic, I probably would have given you a very bad answer, to be perfectly frank. I think it was Mark Twain said prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. Sounds like a Twainism. Technical predictions like this are derived from what I would call a variety of sources: a professional judgment, but also a reliance on what you could broadly call modeling, demographics, looking at the population density in the certain area, how many people could you reasonably expect for this sort of a thing to attract, what have new services in other areas attracted. And sometimes that's a little difficult when you're talking about a new service that's never existed before. In the CEO report, you see a ridership graph about the Detroit to Ann Arbor bus service, and we had ridership forecasts for that one as well. But those were, I think, even more aspirational than some of the things that are in the long-range plan, because there hasn't been a scheduled passenger service between Ann Arbor and Detroit since 1983. So we didn't have a whole lot of historical things to go from. With the things in the long-range plan, we have all our existing knowledge about our service area, our historic trends in ridership. So we're pretty confident in that. But again, recessions, pandemics, new opportunities, we might move faster in some cases than we realize. So we don't want to say that it's a promise carved in stone that will be exactly the number. We want to acknowledge that predictions are by definition a bit aspirational, but we're pretty confident in it based on professional judgment and the research that was done. So aside from the addition and clarification about marketing as soon as we can, the content of the business plan did not change. The Gantt charts in there with the projects and initiatives did not shift. All of that was a great relief to Ms. Reed, because she'd already put all her work into the budget, so she didn't have to change any of that stuff. But I hope that the additional context is useful. The business plan is a always evolving document, and I thank you all for the feedback that you gave me. I think it made for a better document and a better discussion, frankly, about meansy sorts of things. So I appreciate that. I continue to be open to feedback and comment as we move along. At this point, however, in August, I think we're really kind of moving into the budget with specificity. So comments and feedback, either tonight or other times, are always welcome. But we need to move along into the details. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Matt. We'll open the floor now to the board. Do you all have any questions? Susan.
So Dina and Matt got a whole slew for me earlier, so I won't belabor all the questions they asked earlier, but just to give a sense, a lot of them had to do with, under the work plan, we have content around various projects, but there is no content saying, and we will create a promotion and marketing plan for all the new services that are coming in 25 and 26. And I felt it important to talk about that because simply having service on the road doesn't sell it. If people don't know about it, our towns are constantly changing. We're fortunate to have a lot of turnover because of our universities and our hospitals. And I think it's important that at least in 24, even if a lot of the services are not yet online, it should be mentioned as a project, a discrete project, that as the new staff person or persons are coming on, they have this goal of shaping a plan and that we don't lose track of that. I saw the success when ATA as a partner helped co-create the Get Downtown program, and that work to create that created then a spinoff that became the M card. And so I think at this point, at least half of our ridership came from efforts to build on the services that were being added. And I'd like to see somewhere in this work plan for the year, at least something that embraces that we will create some strategy or a set of strategies, a set of tactics that help me at least understand how those ridership projections make sense into the future. So again, a discrete work plan item speaking to promotion and communication. I also spoke a little bit about questions, and I welcome all the other board members to ask questions. Matt and Dina were very kind to not say, you've been here for a couple of years, why don't you know this already? It was very helpful, actually. I feel like I now know more about my own organization. So I give them great thanks for that. So I guess I'll leave it there, but just again, that was a central concern of a lot of the questions that I asked around this plan.
Thank you for that, Susan. Does anyone else have any comments or questions? Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Matt. And one thing that intrigued me, and you pointed out the figure 3 on page, I think it is 7, the chart that shows ridership per capita. It's always very interesting and I think helpful for the board to see comparisons of TheRide versus other transit agencies, particularly ones that we can associate with, and peers and national averages and things like that. And I hope we can even see more. But of course, the thing that jumps out at me on that chart, and I think probably other people too, certainly the pandemic affects everybody, that's no surprise. One thing that really was a surprise to me is a comparison with Lansing. The fact that they have their ridership per capita was very significantly greater than ours. It's still above ours, but not nearly so. I guess that might have something to do with the proportion of students in Lansing to the non-students, but that's just a guess. Do you have any insight into that, Matt?
Absolutely. So when we compare TheRide to CATA, our sister agency in Lansing, it's not the same thing as comparing Lansing to Ann Arbor. CATA does all of MSU's internal campus busing. Here, the U of M has its own bus system, which gets as much ridership annually as we do. So if you were to compare Ann Arbor and Lansing, you'd need to merge all those numbers, and our ridership per capita number would probably be higher than theirs, but we don't try to break that out of their numbers. Rosa Maria and I are doing some work to try to dig into that space to give you guys a little more context of just TheRide plus U of M, where does that put Ann Arbor? And we hope to bring that to you in a little while. It's very statistical, and there are scatter plots involved. I'll try to sell it. But really, it's because CATA merges MSU and local ridership into one bus system, and then they report their numbers, and we can't pull it out. if we and U of M were merged in that respect for reporting, our numbers would be, I think, as high, if not higher than theirs.
You have any insight into why the gap narrowed so much?
You know, we've looked at that. We think it makes sense that us and Lansing bounced back harder and faster than Grand Rapids and Flint, simply because of the students. Back to your original question, I think that very much gives us a built-in market that, you know, frankly turns over every year. We get a new group of customers. Why the gap narrowed, I don't know. I'm not sure. You're right. They had a much higher number in 2018. It's come down quite a bit. We can explore that with our colleagues up there the next time we're up. The other thing, if in case you're curious about the Green Line, that's a merger of 5 other systems across the country, sort of similar sized communities. This is pulled from a statistical report called the National Transit Database, which hasn't been published for 2022 yet, but our local agencies with some prodding from Rosa are nice enough to give us their numbers in advance, and that's why we have the Michigan numbers, but not the national ones.
Thanks, Ed.
Yes, Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, to that point, one of the other questions that I asked was, is it possible to capture and compare against other university towns? Because we are parking short. We are able to encourage transit much more easily than parking rich communities. We have hospitals, we have universities. So could we compare against things like Athens, Georgia? You know, could we compare with other college towns how their ridership is changing? It seems to me much more of an apples to apples comparison than to, as I said, parking rich towns that may have different challenges, but don't have the same, because we have parking constraints, we charge for parking, we're far more likely to gain transit users than other communities who may not have that, who may have oceans of parking lots. So at some point, I would like to hope that ATA could have a comparison of university town transit ridership, so we could understand how other similar communities are faring.
Any other questions? All right, thank you, everyone. We're going to move on. Next on our list is the draft budget presentation, and that is by Ms. Dina Reed.
Okay, can I just ask one more question?
Oh.
So what is the process? Are there still remaining questions to be received on this, or have we moved then to budget, and this is, what is the relationship with the 2 documents? Is this done and coming for approval as well as the budget, or is it just the budget? What is your?
Go ahead, Matt, of course.
Thank you. So the business plan is a CEO document. So no approval from the board is necessary, but obviously your input is valued. If something occurs to you next week, next month, please let me know. This is something that I really appreciate input from everybody on. So it's never done, Susan, honestly. But it is, at a certain point, I do need to sort of cut it off and say, Dina, here are your marching orders. You've got to build a budget. This plan exists if your policies, the ends policies and the executive limitations are at 30,000 feet. The budget is very granular. 1 year, how's the money going? We perceived the need for an intermediate document to help, get from 30,000 feet to like 10,000, and then Dina can land the plane. So this provides the strategic connection between your goals and what she is asked to put into the budget. So that's the intent of it. It is a CEO document, so approval's not sought, but I certainly need to make sure you guys are generally okay with the thrust of it. And the intent is to show you the general, very meansy initiatives and practices that we intend to incorporate into the budget, so we can have those conversations, earlier, and hopefully not, in late September as we're under the gun to get the budget approved. But
Thank you for that.
never done.
Did that help you, Susan? Are you? Wonderful. Just in case, are we all done? All right, thank you so much, everyone. Dina, you can proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. Okay. All right, so the draft budget presentation is in your packet. The issue brief is fairly brief because the draft budget document is quite lengthy. The presentation tonight will be shorter than the draft budget document, but longer than the issue brief. So there you go. Our agenda tonight is to discuss general things in the beginning, budget timeline, alignment with ends, important things that lead into the budget process. And then to also talk about the operating and capital draft budgets and in a way that connects the corporate business plan with the budget and gives you a good understanding of what the high level initiatives are, what some of the key assumptions are, what our projection looks like over the next year and even over a longer projection period. And just tell you generally how the state of the budget is going at this point in time, and then future steps and conclusions. So I'm going to start by just diving right in to the 2024 operating and capital draft budget. This is our budget timeline, and we are more than halfway through. So we're about a month out from asking for your official approval of the budget for fiscal year 2024. Tonight, we'll have an official public hearing, which is a requirement, but also something that we value in terms of getting public input. We've had public comment open for several weeks now. We've been doing outreach on the internet and our website. Tonight and at every board meeting, there is an opportunity for public comment in addition to the official public hearing. From here on out through the month of September, there will be some finalizing of initiatives by staff. We've gone through most of the initiative requests that align with the corporate business plan. We're prioritizing them. We've already incorporated many of them into the budget that you see today. The only ones outlined will probably be more minimal, so I don't expect big changes coming between August and September unless we get different feedback from the board or the public that we need to consider and make different changes, in which case we'll let you know what they are as we present the final budget for approval. So as we have said a few different times, and I just want to make sure we're maintaining our focus, is that the budget does advance board's ends. It's the tool that we use on an annual basis and a long-term basis to make sure that we're budgeting and planning and being able to fund the important initiatives that come out of what we as an agency do. I'm not going to go through all of these, but what I want to share with you about this slide is that you can see that I've listed the key, the very first page essentially of your ends document. And I've assigned little pictures for what they represent. As we go through the budget process here and the budget discussion, you'll see these kind of come through. And they're meant to orient you to the fact that everything we do as we go through the budget process somehow ties back to these ends. So I hope that you see that correlation as we go through, and I'm happy to walk you through that. Most importantly, the budget is aligned with business plan priorities. And the three highest priorities or objectives in the corporate business plan are to attract new riders and increase ridership, to provide excellence in service delivery, and to continually improve agency-wide in terms of staff development and customer service and everything else. So I just wanted to orient you right off the bat that everything that we're doing through the budget process today in some way aligns with these objectives and the board's ends as indicated off to the left there. So the top row kind of correlates to the outer loop more directly than the other two, and then the other two you can see they're correlated that way. Another important element to remind folks is that we are following policies and best practices when we do budgeting. The board's ends also has a financial planning and budgeting policy 2.4. Many of the policy elements are described here. There are also things that are required in terms of meeting regulatory guidelines, federal, state, and local regulations. We comply with all of the regulations, all of the compliance requirements, and all of the requirements and asks that the board sets forth in their board's ends policies as outlined here. This isn't wholly the list, it's just a majority of them. And what we're going to tell you today is that we are able to present this budget that includes operation of full service levels. We're accelerating and phasing in promised millage services that were approved last year by voters and the board. We are not planning to increase fares. The budget is balanced and capital projects are funded. So now we're going to go through a little bit of the operating budget. As we go through, as you might expect, there are many changes that happen throughout the budget. There's lots of assumptions, things going up, things going down. The budget presentation today is my effort to align you to the key issues that we're facing, the key opportunities that we have, and how we're addressing those in the budget. So the first point I want to make is that the budget is balanced, as I've mentioned before. Revenues and expenses are $60.5 million. And you can see an outline here of some of the key revenues and some of the key expenses. But most importantly, I want to share on the expense side, close to 90% of our budget is spent on transportation services, either directly through AATA or purchased transportation services. So that's an important point. A majority of our funding comes from property tax revenues, state operating assistance, and federal operating assistance is higher than normal because of the pandemic relief fund. So that's where you're seeing that come through. We expect that will taper off into next year, as we've talked about a little bit, and we'll continue to talk about. Passenger revenues and other types of revenues that we collect are the least amount of our revenues. So the budget provides funding for initiatives. And you can see here that this looks much like the table that I presented earlier, and that's intentional. That's because these initiatives are categorized according to the way we think about and align with the board's ends. So millage services and advocacy are a key portion of our first, go back to it, attracting riders and increasing ridership. And excellence in service delivery is the next one, and so on, so that the way we're addressing that in the budget is the daily mission of operating transit services. Staff development, customer satisfaction, and sustainability are a key part of the third. Included in millage services and advocacy for the budget this year, such things as additional staffing at the YTC, 30-minute service, bus stop improvements. Advocacy agenda includes additional funding for board participation and advocacy. All of these things are part of providing increasing ridership over the course of the year. A majority of our budget, as I mentioned before, is to operate our transit services. We've incorporated into the budget the millage services, as I said, but also included in normal daily transit services are things like operations and maintenance, facilities maintenance, equipment maintenance, and we have initiatives around all of those as well. In terms of staff development, customer satisfaction, and sustainability, we're focusing on team and staff development, customer satisfaction brainstorming, sustainability planning, and zero emission studies. All of those initiatives are funded in the budget that's presented in the draft. By and large, a majority of the increases that we're seeing on the expense side in fiscal year 2024 are related to the operating of the millage services that we've committed to, and we're excited to be able to do that. You're seeing that come through in the budget in a couple of different key areas that I wanted to mention here. You're seeing an increase in salaries, wages, and benefits as a result of 35 new FTEs that are focused on strictly operations. That's the operational and support staff directly required for the increase in the services that we're going to provide starting in fiscal year 2024. We also have an increase in purchased transportation. You may have seen that in the more detailed portion of the packet, and that again is the expansion of services. The whole increase there is TheRide and additional services that are related to the millage. Here's a phase-in look of what it looks like. So some of the questions that we've gotten to date from the board about the millage and about the budget are, why is it costing so much if we're not starting service to the fall or August of 2024? And there's a couple different reasons for that. First of all, we're already accelerating some of the millage services or some of the portions of the millage. Examples are some of the administrative staff that were approved in the millage have already been hired. Two customer service representatives are now already stationed at the YTC. So we're really excited to be able to do that. We have additional administrative support type services from staff that will be implemented by October 1. We have facilities staff, we have maintenance staff, especially fleet maintenance staff that need to be hired as early as October 1, much before the start of the actual service. And as you can see here in the graph, we've layered those in. So we've got our current full service schedule at the bottom. Then we're layering in the accelerated millage initiatives that we've already started in fiscal year 23. We're layering in additional accelerated millage options that we have in 2024. And then the other two layers are the staff required and the phasing in that's required over the fiscal year to be ready to go and deliver service in August of 2024. It takes time to train operators and staff. It takes time to get staff. So we are planning a phased in approach so we can properly train them and have them ready to go when we promise the service. This is all funded in the budget. I thought it'd also be good to take a step back and look at what we've looked like over time with FTEs. So this shows FTEs from 2019 into 2024. And you can see that basically from 2019 to 2023 or 2022, it's been pretty stable, right around 295 employees, give or take, given the year. You can see a decline in FY 2020. We had staff reductions during the pandemic, and then we slowly added them back over time as we added service back. But generally, that's all we had, the budget for. So that's what we managed to, and those positions are consistent accordingly. It starts to go up in fiscal 23 because of those accelerated millage options that I mentioned that we exercised, and then it's going to go up significantly in 2024 to make sure that we have the staff we need for the millage services. All of the positions that you see here are funded and are funded in accordance with our plan and projections for the millage services. Another important point I want to make about our budget for fiscal 2024, besides the millage, is that we have a lot of cost pressures. Cost pressures are coming through in many areas of our budget. The good news is in terms of staff salaries and wages, we have union agreements in place for several years, so that's pretty stable. What we are seeing really that's really hitting us hard this year is the cost of vehicle maintenance and some risk associated with buses. This graph shows, the line graph actually just shows a couple of different sources for costs related to transportation, equipment, and manufacturing. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the key point here is if you look at 24 to 2019 or 2020, things looked pretty stable over a long period of time. Post-pandemic, however, it's extremely volatile. There's big increases, big decreases, and we're watching that as we go. The important point here is that everything is going up and there are impacts throughout the budget. So when you looked at the detailed budget, you probably noticed increases in fuel, materials, and supplies and contractual services. Those increases are wholly a result of the additional costs related to this type of inflation specifically. Vehicle maintenance is contracted out in some cases because of the type of work that needs to be done and the specialty that we don't have on staff to rebuild transmissions and things like that that have to be addressed. Fuel, materials, and supplies in the past was attributable to the fuel increases. However, they've stabilized, and that's actually been an upside in our budget this year because we were at such high levels before. It's not exactly what it looks like today on the street, but for the year and for the projection period, we do expect that to be stable. However, what's going up dramatically is what's being shown in this chart is the cost of the materials related to fixing buses, bus parts, and all things basically related to vehicle maintenance. So this is causing significant increases in our budget. I'll just wait. Yeah. All right, which I have, which has been noted here on the slide as well. So you can make a correlation between what I'm sharing with you, the assumptions that we're making, and how they impact the operating expense budget. So here's a nice look at the longer term impact of what operating expenses have looked like. You can see that much like our FTE counts, that historically up until 2021, things were fairly stable, some increases, some decreases over time. And there are, of course, reasons for that. 2020 and 21 were decreases because we pulled back on service, didn't offer full service levels for parts or whole of the years of those years. And then we come back in 2022 and you can see a significant increase. As you know, we've been receiving pandemic relief funds, and that's the reason we're able to afford it. We didn't have any other type of funding to rely on, but when the pandemic relief funds were here, we were able to meet the needs that we have in terms of going back to full service levels. We had seen increases in paratransit services last year. You may remember that. So that's one of the increases from 21 to 22. That's stabilized now with the contract that we have in place, but it was part of the larger increase from 21 to 22. And then also we did come to new agreements with our union regarding their the labor agreements, so that that's more stable now, but there was an increase in those rates, if you remember from last year. So now we're seeing the budget go up again in 23 and 24, and that's a direct result of the millage services and other inflationary factors that I've mentioned to you and we've talked about so far through the presentation. So when we're looking at expenses, the next thing you think about is how do we pay for it? So here is what our revenues have looked like in the past. The most interesting thing I think about this chart is something we've been talking about consistently, and that's the green part of the bars in 21 through 24. That is the pandemic relief funds. So you see it comes into full force in 2021 to pay for those expenses that I just described. And then it starts to go away in 2024 as we're going to expect less pandemic relief funds throughout the year. So pretty much the revenues have been stable with some increases and decreases. And then, of course, the uptick in revenue due to pandemic relief funds. So since we're talking about revenues, I want to talk about a few things that we look at when we think about what do we budget for revenues and how we build our projections on revenues. Clearly, a ridership is very important to us and a very important indicator of what we expect revenues to be in terms of the passenger revenue. One of the comments from board members since the last presentation was talking about or asked, why do we compare to 2019? And I said, well, basically because since 2019, we've gone down, and the first order of business is to try to recover back to the point at which we were pre-pandemic. But I thought it would be helpful for all of us to look at the progression from 2014, because there were declines in ridership in the industry prior to the pandemic. And you can see that even TheRide was declining just a little bit from 28 to 2019, which is still pre-pandemic. But we were pretty stable from fiscal year 14 to 2019. So we think that measuring against 2019, at least at this point, is still a good way to refer to how our ridership is recovering. But of course, we don't want to just stop there. We do want to keep our feet on the gas and try to increase ridership even more than what we were in the past. But you can see here by this graph that has challenges, and it has been something that has not grown significantly over a 10-year period. So we'll just keep our eye on this, and it's a metric that we'll continue to follow, and I know the board's very interested in, so we'll continue to share it. So another key point of revenues is pandemic relief funds. And the key point I would like to make here, besides reminding you all that the pandemic relief funds will be utilized fully in 2024 for the first time since we started receiving them. However, We will have the millage funding coming in late 2024, and that will fund operations for 2025. So we have a sustainable plan. What I'm showing you here is that in the 2023 budget, which is the bottom bottom bar there, we had initially anticipated using in 2023, this fiscal year, $17.3 million of pandemic relief funds, which would provide a surplus in 2023 of about $11.5 million. Given the acceleration of the millage services that we've been doing and the phasing in that we will do, which was part of the discussions during the millage proposal, was could we use some of these pandemic relief funds to promise services sooner than we actually get the millage money? And we said yes. So our answer to that is here. In order to balance the budget in 2024, we need to use more pandemic relief funds than we would have had. So what we're anticipating doing is slowing down the use of pandemic relief funds in the fourth quarter so that they will be available as we start fiscal year 2024. What that means is our 2024 budget is projecting that in 2023, this year, we will only use 13.4 million instead of 17.3, but we'll use 8.2 million in 2024, which is the blue on the right there on the top, instead of 4.1 million next year, which is what we had originally planned in 2023. So we're just basically holding that money, and we'll still have a surplus using this method in fiscal year 2023, which will go into the capital reserve. And to the extent we're able to generate any additional revenues or get any more money from the state, because that is something that we've been told is coming, but we just don't know how much it is. If that happens, then we can put the money in reserve faster this year and still only move forward with 13.4 million for next year, but we'll have a higher reserve going in this year than what we're projecting now based on this strategy. This strategy is consistent with not using the 5307 funds at a greater extent, which is something that we kind of floated in the initial budget preview and was quickly picked up as something we wouldn't want to do. So this fiscal year, as I mentioned during the quarter 3 report, we have not been using our 5307 funds for operating, and this budget assumes about a $2.5 million use of 5307, only because that's what was projected originally. And we don't have any more pandemic relief funds than what you're seeing here. So we may need to use that if we get more money from the state for operating assistance than we expect, or any other source of revenue, we will not use the 5307 money. Another impact, and just an assumption, a question that we get sometimes is how do we assume what we're assuming for property tax revenues? Since it's our largest revenue, it's important to make sure that this assumption is on par. As you might have noticed in the Q3 report, 2023 is trending just a little bit higher than what we expected for property tax revenues. And in 2024, there's been a lot of information out there about how we've reached the cap in Michigan, and we will be going up 5% in property taxes. This is only related to the inflation. So this is the index rate multiplier for Michigan state property tax. So we're assuming 5% increase. Now that's the inflationary impact. To the extent valuations change or something like that, that's still something that we don't know. The other things that go into what we get in property taxes is net of monies that cities are able to take for like downtown and districts like that. Those types of captures are something that fluctuate, that we don't have full control over. So we always budget quite conservatively on those and assume that they're going to have captures and all of those things. But essentially our estimated budget revenue for property taxes is going up because of the inflationary impact that the Michigan property tax has been announced. So finally, just to kind of sum up what's coming in and what's happening in the budget from 23 to 24, is revenues are going down as a result of reduced use of pandemic relief funds. We have more state operating assistance, we have additional property tax revenues, and we do have a slight increase in passenger revenues based on our expectation and our projection that ridership is going to increase. Our expenses are going up significantly, $4.5 million or 8% for. They're going up to fund the millage services and some of the inflationary cost pressures that we've talked about, but all in, with, even with a decrease in revenue and an increase in expense, we're still able to balance the budget. But we're not projecting a surplus next year, which will be the first year since we started receiving pandemic relief funds. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the budget opportunities and risks that we're still monitoring and probably will monitor throughout the whole fiscal year. As Matt said about the corporate business plan, things change and we are resilient and we're flexible when we need to be. And we're constantly watching what's happening, and we're doing that with the budget as well. Things change as we go into the fiscal year, and we have to ebb and flow with that as needed. But here are some significant risks or things that we're just kind of watching. Not that I think there's anything significant coming, but those are just things that we're going to have to watch because there's some volatility. Most importantly, our opportunities. We're really excited that the community has supported our millage proposal and that the board has also supported that and is working so tirelessly to help us with that. We're continuing service to our communities and we're accelerating the millage services as promised. We're planning for our long-range plan, and we have an approved millage that will last 5 years that starts in 2024. So those are all things that make us more stable and make us that our opportunity is and not risk. Risks are things like volatility, continued volatility in areas that we know of, or volatility in things that we haven't seen yet. State and federal funding, those are things that can change. We do think we might have an upside in state funding coming in 2024, but that's a one-time opportunity. And we won't expect that to continue. And what happens after that, we won't know. Ridership recovery is always something that we're working towards, but you can see that it takes time. And we are constantly working towards that, but there is some risk in that the projections that we've set forth here could potentially not be accomplished. Another risk is staffing. We've been hit pretty hard on the administrative side in the past year and a half with regard to maintaining staff or hiring new staff. And we have to hire a lot of employees in the next year, especially on the operations side, the maintenance side. So that's a risk. If we run into any trouble with staffing, that could pose some risk to the budget. It could pose some risk to the timing. There isn't anything that we know of that makes us think that we can't do it. But I just want to make sure that people recognize that's a big, heavy lift to hire all those people, but we're excited to be able to do it because it's good for our communities. And then finally, the phasing of the millage initiatives potentially is a risk depending on all the factors that we've talked about. So even though there are opportunities and risks, we're in a good financial position. But it's important to remember what we've accomplished over the last 18 months and how we got to where we are today. So you can see here that this was the historic financial outlook a couple of years ago. Many of the board members here probably remember seeing this graph more times than they care to count, and I was hoping we wouldn't really have to look at it. But it is important that we remember that the millage services that are funded and what we have in revenue today is not something that is the millage service money will not grow significantly. So property taxes are pretty much set and can change for inflation and other things. But we've made assumptions on what those revenues will be, and hopefully they'll be realized and we'll work to make that happen. But the reality is we don't know for sure. And if we don't take careful stewardship of our expenses and monitor things closely, we could end up in a situation like this again. We will not, because we will be prudent. And so we can move on and look at what the outlook looks like today. We have a millage, we have stability with our property tax revenues. We have a strong team and a strong board that recognizes the importance of financial prudence. And with that, we have a stable outlook. We've shifted that graph completely over the last 18 months. And now we're in a position where we have a surplus, potentially a little bit in the first couple of years of the millage, which will help us fund any additional operating reserves required as our budget continues to grow. And then as we get further out into the projection period, we're pretty much at break-even point, which is what we would expect when we set the millage rates. We expected that when we got to the end of the millage period, we'd be in a break-even point, and that's what we're still projecting today. So the news is good. We have a nice stable outlook on our revenues and expenses, money to fund our reserves, and a strong cash flow. With that, I'm going to close out the discussion of the operating budget from my presentation perspective and talk a little bit about the capital budget. But I'm open to questions now, or if you want to save your questions until we get through the rest of the budget, that's fine. So any questions at the moment?
Does anyone on the board have any questions for right now? It can wait. Okay, all right, we're going to let you go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about our capital budget. This budget has changed fairly dramatically since the draft budget. We are making significant capital investments to serve our customers, as we always do. Our 2024 capital budget is $25.8 million, which is significantly more than what was presented in the budget preview. The main reasons for the increases in the capital budget are related to state of good repair. So as you notice, if you look at this chart or this graph, the highest amount of expense that we have is related to state of good repair. And all of these tie back to the board's ends. Again, you're seeing the little symbols there, and that's because even though they might seem like things we just do every day, buying buses and maintaining our facilities are critical, important infrastructure pieces to maintain our services and grow them. So in terms of focusing on one of our key objectives, increase ridership, we have several expansion elements under expansion of services. We have YTC redevelopment, planning and design. We have BTC planning for expansion and redesign of that facility. We have some planning dollars for a new bus garage and some planning dollars for the Washtenaw BRT planning. So again, those are in the early stages, many of them. The YTC is the most urgent project in that list, the thing that we're planning to do sooner. We got a grant that's going to help us with the construction of that facility. And so the planning and design of the YTC redevelopment will be the highest priority under expansion of services. In terms of excellence in service delivery, that's where a majority of that state of good repair money is spent. It's on focusing on excellence in delivery. It's vehicle replacements. It's equipment replacements. It's money to take care of our existing facilities. And the increase that I mentioned in the state of good repair between the budget preview and this draft have to do with increases related to maintenance of the roof and HVAC system of the facility at the operations center, and also the increase in cost of buses. I do want to just mention here that there is some risk about the buses. I think I've mentioned this before, and I just want to make sure that if we're talking about risks in the budget, one of the key risks is our ability to purchase buses and the timing of that, as well as what the costs will be and our exposure to the market risk there. So that is something that we're really focused on, and we are looking at the potential for doing some mid-life cycle replacements and extending the useful life of the bus if we're able to do that efficiently. We're evaluating that. We've added additional funding for buses just to make sure that we can meet the needs that we have and continue to purchase new buses. This is fully funded. So even though the increase is significant, part of it is we didn't buy buses or we haven't ordered buses for 2023 yet. The buses that received in 2023 were actually from 2022. So the funding that we had for this fiscal year is still intact, and we have that to spend into next year. So you will see that as we get into year end, some of the expenses that we planned for in 2023 got postponed for several different reasons. But really that funding is still available and will be available to fund the increases that you see here. Another important point is focusing on our third objective, which is continuous improvement. There is money in the budget for technology, for bus stop improvements, and additional bus stops, bus lane improvements, and zero emission buses studies. So there are things throughout the capital budget that relate directly back to the board's ends, as we talked about in the operating budget. Here's a look at the funding sources that we use. You can see that a majority of our funding sources is state and federal grants. So it's formula funding, it's additional funding that we're able to get on a discretionary basis, it's sometimes earmarks, it's a few different things, but a majority of our funding is federal and state funded and is fully funded for fiscal year 2024. The top part of this project is just, again, a summary of the type of project that it is and the total, and then how it's funded is below. Another really important point to make here on the far right of this table is how much our full program will cost. So if we looked at the detail in the capital plan and we looked at the next, all the way out to fiscal year 2032, you'll see significant costs related to the same projects that I mentioned before, but you get into construction. So the initial costs are very small, planning and design, and then as we move into construction, it gets significant. What you'll also notice is that we have 41% of our program beyond 2024 that is not identified, that we have not identified a funding source. So the capital plan will be monitored and evaluated and adjusted based on funding allows. And that is something that we continue to do. We continue to seek funding. There will be lots of presentations to the board, I'm sure, about all of these major projects individually. But for now, in terms of the capital plan, I just wanted to point out that we'll need more money. So even though we have a capital reserve, the capital reserve money is built into this projection. But even with that, we're still underfunded, and we're going to need that capital reserve. It's really important that we have the capital reserve in order to compete for discretionary grants that will be required in order to make this 41%. There's no expectation that TheRide is going to be able to generate all of that funding on its own. There's going to be partnerships involved. There's going to be hopefully discretionary grant approvals. And those grants will have a better chance of getting approval with the FTA and the state if we can make, first of all, show our local match, and secondly, show that we're putting in money of our own. It really strengthens the grant application when we can say that our community is behind this project and we have money to put towards it. So we want to make sure we're leveraging that capital reserve to the extent that we can to get as much other sources of funding as possible throughout the course of the future in these projects. So I just mentioned about protecting capital reserve. This is what the cash flow looks like in terms of going out to 2028 and spending down the capital reserve, or the way we would need to spend it down if we were going to use that money wholly to pay for projects. Again, a really important opportunity we have is to use that money to leverage other money to get more funding from grants and so on. And we're going to, that's the strategy that we'll impose. But we just want to be clear in that even though we are in a good cash position and we have a well-funded reserve for the projects that we have, they are fully committed. There's no lack of projects needed that require funding. And finally, we're expecting about $37 million of local funds dedicated to the capital reserve for projects directly supporting transportation in our communities. To summarize, we are throughout the budget, both in operating and capital. We are operating full service levels for next year. We're accelerating and phasing in millage services to start in fiscal year 24. We are not planning any fare changes. The budget is balanced, and all the capital projects for 2024 as planned are funded. And that concludes my formal presentation. Happy to answer questions or hear any feedback.
Thank you, Dina, for that presentation. And I just want to say really quickly, you and your team have done a brilliant job. The fact that we are going in with a balanced budget and all of the projects that we're looking at to align for our communities and our customers, it's just really heartening. When I was on this board in 2018, we were talking about crossing the streams. And so we're so much farther and beyond where we were. So that's because of you and your team, so thank you. Susan, you were the first one up earlier, so I'm going to go ahead and call on you if you still have a question.
I have a couple, and thank you for, an excellent presentation. Appreciate it, Dina. You and your staff do an amazing job. My first question is it possible, since there was a point made earlier about the staffing increase, I think there's 35 new staff positions being created in the fiscal year. Is it possible for staff to give us a future look as well as this previous look at what staffing levels were at the agency and will be in the next 5 years? So if this year is 35 positions, what do you anticipate in 25, 26, 27, 28? Just so we have a sense of where it's going. I think that's an important question, again, for the board, just given that we are responsible for our fiscal position. These involve legacy costs as well as, yes, they're there to help provide services, but just to understand what those 35 positions mean as far as future growth and the staff numbers.
So I'll give you a general answer. I would expect that it would be fairly stable for what we're projecting in 2024. There can always be some small increases or decreases depending on what we can fund with the revenues that we are generating, and managing those other expenses that we talked about and expense increases. In general, expenses rise faster than revenues for us. We talked about that a lot during the millage. So it'll be really important that staff levels remain fairly consistent to where they are planned in 2024, because we do not have a sustainable source of funding for that beyond the new millage that we have starting in 2024. So to the extent that we are able to generate more revenues, like property taxes might go up, faster or slower. If they go up a little faster, there could be a little additional revenue there, but there's no real sustainable structural source of funding with property taxes or the millage that would grow past what we're budgeting for in 2024.
So let me repeat what I think I'm understanding. What we're seeing is a staffing increase in this coming fiscal year. That's going to be about it. We're going to stay at that staffing level through the end of this millage.
Yeah, much like what you saw in the previous few years that I pointed out on the FTEs, how they stayed pretty consistent, around 295, give or take. That's pretty much the position we'll be in. They're going to be pretty stable throughout the projection period of the millage.
Okay. Thank you. The second question, you mentioned it a couple times, but I didn't see it tied back into the budget. But I heard earlier also in the business plan, the need for advocacy. I would love to know more about that and feel like it's a growing question. As we mentioned, it came up in our task force where we met with the mayor of the city of Ann Arbor, and what is the role of the board? What is the role of staff? If there's clarity as regards to the budget process on where this needs to go, I guess I'm still not clear whose role it is, how we do it, and maybe our first retreat of the year, or maybe the work plan as we head forward, has to be on this topic, because it's not clear yet to me how it weaves in. But it certainly was mentioned again between the two presentations, and I sort of feel paralyzed. I don't know what we're doing with it. And then my last question, I know I asked you in an email, but it's a curiosity. I understood from the budget how D2A2 figures into our ridership numbers, because we get the dollars, and though RTA is really sort of overseeing it, the numbers show up on our side. Can you explain how the TheRide numbers show up on our side, since I thought that was wholly spun off from us a few years ago? I don't quite see the connection.
So D2A2 is operated, that's incorporated because we get the revenue from the RTA. The TheRide is completely separate now, so we don't collect revenues, we don't have expenses, we really are completely separate. The relationship that we have is that TheRide is able to pick up passengers at the Lake Transit Center. And they're able to kind of utilize that space there to pick up and drop off. But we don't have any direct financial relationship, so we don't count passengers. We don't really have that kind of relationship with them, and that's different for D2A2.
And the only reason I ask it is that when I asked you about the ridership projections as one of my budget questions, you showed it as TheRide and D2A2.
Yeah.
So I got confused.
Yeah.
If it's just D2A2, where those numbers are being shown, that's the only reason I even mentioned it. So they are not TheRide, it's solely D2A2?
Yes, and
Okay.
I'll take a look at that and
Yeah.
make sure that that gets clarified. I will note that in the past, TheRide was included, so there may be something residual there that we'll take a look at and get
Yeah, that
clarified.
graph, by the way, was very helpful
Yeah.
to see how staff are anticipating the growth in ridership. It really helped me a lot to see it, so thank you.
Welcome.
Any other questions? Jesse?
I have a couple questions about media. First, I was hoping you could clarify use of the word media in because sometimes we're referring to fair media, but then there's a couple places where media is a standalone term, and I wasn't sure if that meant like communications media or like fair media. So like there's a table on 31 of the budget book where media is a standalone term. And I wasn't sure if that was fair media or like media relations.
Okay, I'm on page 31.
Okay.
Can you guide me?
So the table is figure 15. And then I do have a question about the statement, which is the second bullet point, but I first wanted to make sure I was clear on what media was. So you have like,
Oh, yeah, so so for media here, as a part of the operating expense, those are actually expenses that are spent to kind of promote education about services. And a majority, I think a majority of that is related to D2A2 and reimbursed by the RTA.
okay.
So what other media?
So I think that I wanted to make sure that wanted to make sure is that term. I think I understand the use of the word media in the other places. It tends to refer to fair media, but but staying on page 31, you said the media expenses appear lower, and as assumptions are finalized, we anticipate the expenses to be comparable. That seemed it was a little bit vague, and I was wondering what kind of assumptions and things were going into that.
Right, so we actually identified after the draft was completed that there was additional expense that we had and then an additional offset to that. So we're going to be updating that explanation in the final budget. I'll provide a better explanation of what it is, and I expect that number actually to change slightly. It won't be significant in terms of the overall budget, but I do expect that particular line item to actually come in slightly over fiscal year 23, and that's why we phrased it that way, because we needed to relook at those assumptions before we were ready to finalize that number.
Okay, and I have one more question, and that was about in terms of the projection, the unidentified funding. You know, that's something that's looks very scary to have like all of these plans, but I think it's notable that for 2024 there is no unidentified funding. So I was wondering if you could provide, or are there examples of funding sources in the 2024 budget that would have previously been unidentified? Like just.
The unidentified funding is mostly related to expansion projects that have been on, well, they're almost all related to expansion projects that have been on the capital plan or have come into the capital plan. Some of the projects have been on there a while. There's just no funding, so they continue to be kind of pushed out. All of the state of good repair is funded and has been funded and will continue to be funded. That's the first thing we fund with our formula funds, to make sure we can maintain the services that we already provide. So all of the unidentified funding are longer-term projects like bus rapid transit. That's a big one that's on there. The new garage expansion, or the new garage as part of the BRT, is not funded. So those expansion projects, those visionary projects that we need, will need to be funded in some way, but they're several years out in the projection period, and there is time to advocate for funding and fight for funding, I guess, if you will, for discretionary funding. But yeah, they're all expansion projects. And Matt, did you want to add something, or?
Go ahead, Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you. Everything Dina said is absolutely correct. And this is also normal for a transit agency with aspirations, that we have capital projects, BRT, just one example. Those things in the United States are funded through discretionary competitive grants, in this case, small starts. We can't, it's on the plan. It needs to be itemized and identified and booked, so to speak, on the 10-year capital plan. And we know where the funding will have to come from, but we don't have anything signed from the FTA said, yeah, we're ready to give it to you. We're a long way from that. So it has to show up as unfunded until we can win one of those competitive grants. Then Dina will be able to say, the funding for this is coming from this pot of money, and suddenly that's not unidentified anymore.
So it would have been accurate to call that as like future grants, earmarks, et cetera, but you didn't want to be that specific in the term for the
Right.
in the table?
Basically, yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I am
You know,
understanding that.
There are other ways to get funding and partnerships and things like that. So we're not limiting ourselves to any particular source or specifically relying on it, even though realistically, it's probably our largest opportunity for funding of the capital plan,
Earmarks are the other one.
which we were fortunate to get a really big one.
But we
So-
can't tell you that it's identified yet because haven't won them.
Any other questions? Mike?
No, I don't really have a question. Well, I do have a question, Tina. First of all, I wanted to congratulate you on a really terrific presentation. I thought it was excellent. The organization, the use of all the graphics was so helpful. It's so much nicer and easier to see numbers in graphical form. You can see the relative sizes, you can see trends, you can see stuff like that a lot nicer and easier than a whole bunch of numbers, and you used it very effectively. And I guess my question though is, can you provide that to the board? Could you email that to us? And maybe there's an effective way that it could be put online for others to see too, as long as it's, of course, labeled that it's not final yet. But it was really nice. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm certain that we can accommodate your requests.
One last ask, are there any other questions or comments? Thank you, Dina, so much. That wraps up that portion of the budget presentation. I think we are now ready to move on to the public budget hearing. And so I'm going to open it up. I have a script to read, so please bear with me. In accordance with the budget hearings of Local Government Act, local units are required to hold a public hearing on a proposed budget. I will need a motion to suspend the regular board meeting and move to open the public meeting. Do I have a motion? Susan, do I have a second? Second is Mike. And so we are now open for public comment regarding the proposed budget. Do we have anybody online, or is there anybody? Yes, ma'am. Yes, please, and please state your name.
Hi, I'm Raven Calfan. I'm an Ipsy resident. This relates to this. So recently, there was a meeting with the YPD Chief of Police, Fed Up Ministries, and Growing Hope. And while he was there, he mentioned with kind of finality that there's plans to put a substation or police station in the YTC renovation. Does anyone know anything about that?
Mr. Carpenter?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that finality is not warranted. There are no plans to create any substation at the YTC. I think that was maybe a misunderstanding of a friendly communication from our head of operations that if the police would like to stop by from time to time, they're certainly welcome to. But at this time, there is no plans for a substation, an office, or any consistent police presence at the YTC, either the existing building or built into any of the future planning that's going on. So that may have been an error on his part.
Okay, and then I was gonna ask if that was to happen, would there be a commitment to public input on that decision so that the patrons get to decide or have some sway in that? If that was to be proposed.
I don't have a problem with that. No, happy to have a conversation.
Yeah, and then I was gonna ask too, if that happens, are you all like part of the ultimate decision makers in that, or is it city council, or what would be like the flow that?
So that decision about security at the Ypsilanti Transit Center is a decision made by TheRide. We certainly work with the city of Ypsilanti in this case, or the city of Ann Arbor in the other case. But this agency would be the final decisions on that. Most of those decisions are delegated to myself and the staff. We're more than happy to speak with anyone at the city if there are any concerns about it. But I can commit to you right now that no decision on that matter has been made. No offer has been made. In our future planning, that is not something we've been considering, have considered, or presently are considering. I think it was a misunderstanding about a friendly offer to stop by from time to time that maybe, yeah, it kind of sounds like a snowball rolled downhill and grew into something bigger, but we're more than happy to have conversations with the community about any subject.
Okay, cool, thank you. And then just generally, I think maybe you touched on it, Susan, maybe you don't have plans for it now, but just public input in general with the renovations, would that be?
So there are I don't think there are any more renovations to the existing YTC planned. If you're speaking about the planning for the new.
The planning, yeah.
Okay,
sorry,
that we hope to kick off that public engagement this fall. We are in the final stages of negotiating with the consultants who will be doing the work and hosting the public involvement work. We don't have any dates yet, but it is a given that we will be doing public involvement in Ypsilanti, probably at the terminal site, and happy to reach out to the community and happy to speak with you after the meeting to make sure that you and your group are specifically invited.
All right, thank you, I appreciate that. I think those are all my questions. Appreciate your time, great presentation.
Thank you for your questions. And if I could just reiterate what Mr. Carpenter said, the public will not be left out of any of the decision-making process. It's my understanding that we're looking at a NEPA study and things like that. All those things have to kick off first before we can even look at what it could potentially look like, where it's going to lie, and all of those good things. But I really appreciate your comments and you coming out this evening. Are there any other public people here who would like to speak? Mr. Pulaski?
I wasn't anticipating to speak for this budget hearing, but save the best for last, but there's a lot to dig in here. But for the record, Robert Plowski, the Vice Chair for the RTA-CAC. So kind of want to touch into it. One of the things that really sticks out is the no fare changes with the inflation. As you all know, the inflation is going on, and the inflation is, been a conversation in Lansing, but also in Washington. How can we address it? With the service levels and the amount of funding we're receiving, with the acceleration of the millage services, the property tax revenue, and the state, local, and federal funding, including the $60 million that was just allocated to public transit here in the state, is just a huge step forward, especially the $37 million in capital to invest in transportation projects, which really includes US 23. No matter what that project looks like, whether it's a bus going under US 23 or over, but it's still a good project to be investing in, especially with the bipartisan infrastructure dollars. The question that I bring is, this is just the start to an amazing budget. But kind of what Susan touched on, what do we look at in the near future? Whether that's 2025, 2026, 27, 28, because it all boils down to who we have in leadership. Leadership is the big key, how we can continue to advocate for public transit. We have a president right now that's basically investing not just in roads and all types of projects, transportation related, but infrastructure related to public transit. And half that money that came out of the public transit infrastructure dollars from the bipartisan infrastructure bill was allocated to a lot of different agencies in Michigan, Ohio, and all the parts of the East Coast and West Coast. We need to really consider that most of all. Who are we going to be able to look at in the next presidential term to get more transportation funds? We already have an amazing governor that's already put her foot down and said, we are getting public transit invested here in the state. We need to consider the federal level because a lot of our capital dollars are coming in from the federal level. Just wanted to point that out. But all in all, great budget. I'm deeply impressed. I mean, the 5%, projection that we're talking about for inflation rates on property tax owners, it's not your control. Definitely understand that. For someone that has been fighting for public transit for almost 6 years, there's nothing you can do in terms of a 5% increase. But great job to your team, Dina. I'm deeply impressed. And one thing that I'm pretty sure Smart will hate me for saying is Smart is not doing any progress right now. That's one thing I can say for sure. Thank you, Dina, and thank you to the board for all your hard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pulaski. Deb, is there anyone online that would like to speak?
We do. There are actually 3, and the first one is Amber Fellows, and you are unmuted.
Welcome, Amber.
Hi there. Good evening. My name is Amber Fellows. I'm a resident of Ipsy. I see that Monica Ross Williams is on the roster. I don't know if I see her at the meeting, but if you're there, it would be great to chat with you. So I'm here because I'm under the impression that until this got brought up by Raven earlier and staff, that the board had been largely unaware that there was this pitch for a collaboration between the AAATA and the Ipsy Police Department. And what we've been hearing is that this brand new Ipsy Police Chief, Kirk Moore, has been making moves to install a YPD substation at the new YTC. Most recently, he advocated for this at the Ipsy DDA meeting this morning, actually. And we've heard that, from staff just now, that you're not necessarily in conversation with the chief, but, just this morning, he said that he intends to put a substation at the YTC. So something is amiss here. And my gut reaction is that it sounds like your staff are going rogue a little bit and potentially indicating a green light to something that is entirely premature. And in order for this board to function, you really need to be fully informed of the communications going on regarding development of the YTC, including the issue of the substation, and work to rein in any backroom dealing that may be occurring. There is already security present at YTC, and so the reasoning for adding armed enforcement seems to be a regressive decision that is out of touch and out of step with what riders and commuters would want of a new space. As I understand it, this body is made up of 9 or 10 members. One is from the city of Ipsy, which presents a weakness as far as understanding the perspective of riders and residents in and around the YTC. Another reason why more input is needed from Ipsy and the ridership to what the needs are and what people actually want to see there. When those public input sessions come down the pike for that project, this body ought to meet in the city of Ipsy. That's why a lot of us are on Zoom today. So the chief of YPD, he's brand new. He has been in town for a few months, spending the bulk of his career in Nevada until he was hired in April. He is one voice and a weak one at that, having very little understanding of community needs and is dismissive of unarmed crisis response alternatives to the police. And he's been dismissive openly at the YPAC meetings. And this kind of statement is quite out of touch with the consensus of Ipsy residents, even including the mayor of Ypsilanti, Nicole Brown, who has made a campaign promise to prioritize an unarmed crisis response team. So an alternative to this potential discussion that's been going on, some concrete ideas that have been asked for about routinely are for like a non-commodified community space where riders could have coffee, sit down in air conditioning or heating, and where a third party support services like the health department or pullover prevention or daytime warming center could utilize and be host of a potential auxiliary space at YTC. Raven asked a lot of the questions that I had. I think the one thing I want to add is that I do ask for this body to make a resolution to commit to not have enforcement agencies at the new transit center. I think that would send a strong statement to staff to halt any potential communication that's happening that doesn't include the body. So yeah, this is an opening bid to you all. I think we will continue to tell more people and issue stakeholders. So if we don't hear movement or commitments within the next months, like we're going to bring out more people. So I do expect to hear from you. Please reach out to me. My name is Amber Fellows. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Do we have someone else?
We do. The next one is Diana Gonzalez, and you are unmuted.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Diana Gonzalez. I live and work in Ypsilanti. I used to work in Ann Arbor. I attend the Buddhist temple there. I'm from New York City. I've ridden public transit most of my life. Olympia, Washington is a great college town that I would look to as a great example in terms of it actually being accessible for multiple people. I don't think TheRide is. I can't get to the temple because the times either for the afternoon service or the morning service don't allow me to either get there or get home after. I want to ask another clarifying question on the back of what Raven Calfine asked about who makes the ultimate decision. Mr. Carpenter said he did, and then TheRide. Those are all very vague responses. I'm, as a racialized person, concerned of the makeup of the board and who's making those decisions and whether they understand the danger I feel in my hometown. I work a couple of blocks from the YTC, and I walk all around town. I've been part of the non-motorized traffic advisory committee at IPSI. The fact that it's walkable, that IPSI is an equitable place. It's a place where I belong. When I go to Ann Arbor, I get run off the sidewalk because people don't make space for me. So I want to feel that TheRide, that I have a place here. I love this area. I chose this as my home almost 20 years ago. I raised my kids here. I plan to retire here. It's very important to me. And the decision, these backroom conversations in the age of the pandemic and Black Lives Matter, we're a decade into it, is so blind and hurtful. So I would like to have not just a commitment to actual public engagement. I'm just confused about where some of these developments are happening and who's involved in these discussions and then who's making the decision. Yeah, I mean, because Mr. Carpenter said, well, I'll make the decision and then TheRide and we'll talk to the city. These are all very vague responses. But I think if you have a commitment to equity, to belonging, and to people feeling safe, and to actually increase engagement with TheRide and not just having it, I don't know who you're trying to appeal to. I would like I want to know exactly who's making those decisions.
Thank you for your comments. Deb, is there anyone else?
Yes, the next one is Jim Mogensen, and you are unmuted.
Welcome, Jim.
So, so one of the things from Ann Arbor, so one of the things that I would hope that would be available in the next version of the budget before adoption, that would be helpful to me anyway, is to have an appendix that has the purchase of service agreements in them, so that we'll be able to track that. There was a time when I was able to get access to those directly. And I think it's important just to understand in some of the long range capital planning that's happening. Some of those activities are happening in municipalities that are not part of the millage. I'm thinking over by the Myers and some of that transit centers. So I just wanted, so just to track those, it would be helpful to have the purchase of service agreements, and they're not secret. Something that has been more controversial is the University of Michigan contract. And one of the reasons that I think it's important to know the current status of that contract is that the M-Card program, which was started back in like 2004, was a result of federal policy. And the federal policy people said, we have these large public universities that have their own bus systems, and they are also located in cities that have their own public transit systems. What can we do to encourage cooperation? And they said, we'll bring money to the table. And so we'll allow the university bus systems to qualify for money. But we won't give it to them directly because it would just sublimate what they're already spending. So they will have to go, since it's that federal money and we have all these complex rules, it has to go through the public transit systems, the local public transit systems, which is why that happens. And as a result, one of the things that happened, as Mr. Carpenter was talking about at CATA, right, the Capital Area Transit Authority, was that they kind of merged both of those systems. So they're both together now. Here in Ann Arbor area, what happened was that the quote unquote fares would be paid. And most people don't realize that some of that is federal money. The reason this matters over the long term is that when the pandemic happened, the university bus system also shut down. And it's been unclear what happened, how that impacts the M-Card program going forward. Is that money there? Is the university using it from parking and transportation? A very long time ago, I tried to understand what was going on. I went down to what was then the Fleming building to ask that question, and was told that that information is only available on a need-to-know basis. And I hadn't gotten that kind of information, that kind of response, since I was doing some work on the Nixon administration at the archives. So some of this is kind of murky. It's just important for everyone to understand how that's working and what options are happening. And finally, I think there are some capital risks that are happening. There's some bridging that is going on that is a real concern. I have some concerns about the bus rapid transit, not because I don't like but bus rapid transit, but I have some concerns about being able to implement it. And we're bridging millage. We're bridging millage brackets on these large. We have to assume that every time the millages will pass in order to continue to move forward on these very large initiatives. And the other thing in terms of capital funding is I was around when the structural deficit started. And it wasn't because people weren't prudent, it was because they were too prudent. And and outside folks said, no, we need hybrid buses. And all of a sudden, hundreds of thousands of dollars had to be moved around. So I think it's important to realize that we some of those risks continue in the long-term capital budget, independent of the not knowing where the funding is coming from. And finally, I would like to hope that I recognize that the millage, the recent millage proposal last year included money allocated to funding staffing at the Ypsilanti Transit Center. And I would like to have proactive work going forward. I recognize that that will happen during the context of the millage, but in the next step, that be incorporated in the ride's overall budget, as opposed to being separated out into the millage. And once you get into these structural problems, they can kind of continue on. So I'm hoping that having staffing at both the Blake Transit Center and the Ypsilanti Transit Center becomes standard and is incorporated in the regular budget. And finally, if I sound grumpy, I'm not as grumpy as I sound. But I would like to thank you all. This is, I really did appreciate the budget presentation. There's some new forms and charts and information that is very helpful in terms of sorting things out. Thank you.
Thank you. Deb, is there anyone else online?
No, there's no one else.
All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and close out public comment. You're giving me a look, Matt. What is it that you need?
If it, and public hearing rules are a little different. I hope I might be able to respond to some of the questions that have been asked at the appropriate time.
I was actually wondering if we should close out public comment, finish our business, and then put this under emergent items, because to me, this needs to be addressed this evening. It should not be dropped. Something very emergent has happened, and it's been brought to our attention, and I think it needs to be addressed during the meeting. And I'm wondering if under emergent items is the best place, or since we already have traction, close out the public meeting and go ahead and answer the questions.
At your discretion, I would prefer to answer them immediately.
All right, then let's. But you want to answer them before we close it out?
If that's permissible, I'm not, there is,
I think it's kind of more loosey-goosey with this sort of thing. And so
in my
let's just,
experience.
since it's already been brought up during the budget process, the questions need to be answered. Let's go ahead and continue to leave the floor open so that the dialogue can continue, and then we'll close it out when it's done. I think that works for me. Does it work? Okay.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to respond to some of the very passionate and I think important questions that have been asked this evening, both in attendance and virtually. And I hope folks are still online. Okay. So I want to string together a little bit here, because obviously this is an important issue. It's not budget related specifically, but still warrants, I think, some clarification. And I think I know enough of the background here to help everyone understand what has occurred. So a week or so ago, Jesse Miller, who is the representative from the city of Ypsilanti, contacted me and said, there's some concern in the city. Some folks think there's going to be a lot of police at the Ypsilanti Transit Center. Was any sort of deal made? And George Brooks, our still recently arrived Deputy CEO of Operations, and I spoke to Jesse. That was the first we had heard of this. But I think we kind of began to understand perhaps where what I will characterize as a misunderstanding began. When George arrived a few months ago now, 6? Okay. I let him know that I had concerns from a security perspective for our staff. This gets to the question of who's calling the shots, and I think one of the callers asked who's in control. The answer, broadly speaking, is the board of directors is in control. They write policy, and I may allude to some of those policies, but they delegate the implementation of those policies to me. One of those policies is to keep staff safe and riders safe. Knowing that we have had over the last year or so a couple of disturbing incidents, not necessarily in Ypsi, but yes in Ypsi, but across the system, frankly. I said to George, I need you to take this issue in hand and begin to figure out how to do that. As part of that, George took it on himself to go out and meet the local police chiefs, which I thought I encouraged and I supported, and I think that's an excellent step. There's been a lot of turnover in those offices recently, and although I have known previous police chiefs, I didn't know the newest ones. He went and met with the acting chief of police in Ann Arbor and the newly arrived chief of police in the city of Ypsilanti. My understanding, and if we need George to say more, we certainly can. George had what I would characterize as informal, get to know you kind of conversations with both chief of police, simply institution to institution, reestablishing connections, and yes, saying, hey, if you'd like to stop by the terminals from time to time, we'd love to have you. Not in any nefarious way. I want to be clear about that, but because we have had genuine security issues at both terminals. And I want to be clear, we have had shootings and other incidents. So this is not imagined concerns. However, I want to be very, very clear with everyone listening at home or in the audience. No deals were made to create a substation. George, I think we need to call the chief tomorrow, if not tonight, and sort of clarify for him if he's saying something other than that. Perhaps he should stop, because we do not have any arrangement to do that. We have no arrangement or agreement to have any sort of permanent police presence either at the Ypsilanti Transit Center today, nor has it been discussed as part of the planning for the future Ypsilanti Transit Center. I can see, however, how, and without speaking to the chief, I don't know quite how this snowball has picked up the speed it has, but I want to assure the public and the board there's no backroom dealing or staff going rogue here. I think this is some sort of misunderstanding that George and I are going to sort out tomorrow. The board gives me my instructions, and one of them, which policy 212, says that the CEO shall not allow anyone to be discriminated against with respect to the AAATA services. And I know that I and George and the board members take that very seriously. Even the perception that anything like that could be happening is very worrisome to me. So I don't want to speak for Jesse, but I think he would be quite happy to join me and George and speak with folks in the community to fully understand, first of all, the perspective. I want to listen, not talk, but also to reassure in any way that I can that no plans have been made and no deals have been struck. I think there's some sort of misunderstanding going on. And to better understand the interests of the community in general. So we're more than happy to have dialogue, and I hope those comments are in some small way reassuring. I can tell there's a lot of passion about this subject, and I am very sorry that something has kind of gotten out of hand. Thank you for the opportunity to respond, Madam Chair.
No, I appreciate that. As the board chair, I just want to echo what Mr. Carpenter said. He called me straight away after Jesse had contacted him last week and let me know that there was a conversation, that everything was just more of a, hello, this is what we're doing. Do you want to stop by? I have not been made aware. I trust Mr. Carpenter implicitly, and I have not been made aware of any backdoor dealings of this is what we are going to do and this is what we are going to implement. And the board will be holding further discussions at the committee level, I'm sure, before we come to the next board meeting. And hopefully at the next board meeting, we'll have more finite answers. I have to say that I'm shocked at how much traction something got. To hear what occurred this morning is disheartening, but I really appreciate the fact that you came out and that you shared your concerns with us, and they are very valid and they are heard by the board, and we are going to move forward to get you some better answers, okay? All right, thank you so much, everyone. And so with that, we are going to go ahead and close the public comment portion of the budget hearing process. It is now concluded, and I will need a motion to close it, to close the public hearing and resume the regular board meeting. Do I have a motion to close the public hearing? That would be by Mike. And do I have a second? That would be by Simi. And all in favor, please raise your hands. And that is unanimous. Thank you, everyone. All right. Now we're going to move on to the Title VI update. Is Mr. Yang with us on the screen? Wonderful. Welcome, Forrest.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Madam Chair. Sorry for not being there in person due to some health issue. Again, going back to the Title VI update, as you remember, our consultant did a quick presentation last board meeting. So kicked off the public engagement process. And then the following week, we had 2 in-person meetings, 2 virtual meetings. we talked to a lot of people at the Blake Transit Center, Ypsilanti Transit Center, even though people don't know, a lot of people don't know what Title VI program is about. So we took that opportunity as a kind of an education session, introduce the topic and ask them in general how they feel about the service or anything related to Title VI, any issues. So a couple of things was brought up. For example, the waiting space at the Ypsilanti Transit Center, the lack of fair sales, because we did the public engagement prior to August 1st. So I think those issues are valid, and we've been in the process, or other already addressed, or in the process to address, like the new Ypsilanti Transit Center planning will add a lot more space, indoor, outdoor, for customers waiting. And in general, I think the majority, I would say over 90% customers or general public we talk to are very happy with our service, with our employee. I mean, providing their customer service, so, which is very positive. Some things related to service was brought up as well. So we recorded those comments. We also, passed that along to different department in the organization to address. Like I said, in general, 90, I would say over 90% of responses are very positive. Again, so the Title VI program update, the public comment period will end on August 20, which is end of this week. And then after that, we're going to summarize all the feedback, and we'll incorporate them into the final program update. Hopefully, we'll bring that back to the board for your approval in September with the entire report, which will go to FTA later this year. So we'll continue this conversation with the service committee and possibly finance committee, and then a next board meeting. Meanwhile, if any board member or public member has any other feedback, questions, comments, please feel free. Either you can send me an email or you can go on our website, provide feedback there. Thank you. That's my quick update.
Thank you, Forrest. Does anyone on the board have any comment or question for Mr. Yang? Seeing none, thank you very much, Forrest, for your time.
Thank you.
Moving on, we're going to go to the CEO report. That is Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A few things I'd like to highlight in the written CEO report, which begins on page 24. First of all, a couple of successes. My congratulations to the community relations team. Some of you have asked periodically about the new ride guide. This is our traditional means of hard copy distribution of route information. It got a little unstable during the pandemic. I'm happy that they completely redid it. This is an example of the new format. It is a little smaller, a little less boilerplate information, hopefully easier for folks to use. I encourage you to take it with you everywhere. One thing we didn't mention in the budget discussion is coming up shortly on the heels of that. After that's approved in September, executive team is working to bring you the bus propulsion recommendation that I promised you in October. I'm happy to say we're still on track with that. Executive team is having parallel conversations there. I believe we have a path forward to a good recommendation. I hope you all will find it interesting. The timeline on that, we have plenty of time to discuss after we table it in October. I won't need a decision from you until January, I would say at the latest. So you'll have plenty of time to sort of ponder that and get your heads around it. I'm very proud on page 25 of the graph showing D2A2 ridership. This is something that, kind of gets, I think, lost in the shuffle maybe. This was a project, a partnership between us and the Regional Transit Authority. They pay for it. We do pretty much everything else. um, to reestablish scheduled transportation service for the first time between Washtenaw County and the city of Detroit. It hasn't existed since the last commuter rail train ran in 1983, I think. I'm very happy with this graph. It is heading in the right direction. You can do all the projections and forecasts you like, but it's a whole lot more gratifying to see it actually happening. Ridership is now averaging between 4,000 and 5,000 trips a month. It does take, at least 2 years for a service like this to get established, and for a longer distance service that's maybe even a little bit more. I think, perhaps the RTA could be funding more media advertisements on this. Nevertheless, I think it's heading in a very good direction, and some credit probably goes to Taylor Swift for concerts that recently occurred, but I think there have been other ones that generated ridership as well. Bus manufacturer instability, as Dina alluded to, there's a lot of things going on in the manufacturing sector. It's pandemic hangover time. People are putting Humpty Dumptys back together all over the place, and some of the pieces are not quite fitting together. We've seen recently, as last week, the Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing of Proterra, what I would characterize as the Tesla of the EV battery electric bus market. And Nova Bus, one of the three legacy bus manufacturers, has decided to exit the US market and return to their core strength in Canada. This is an indication of the inflation, supply line issues, staffing problems that are roiling not just the transit industry, but many other places. So executive team is bobbing and weaving on this. Dina and George and Troy are bringing forth some really good recommendations to ensure we continue to have a stable supply of vehicles. This is very important for a group like us, and we look forward to being able to execute some quick maneuvers as the time permits. And then most importantly, something I need to broach with you guys on page 26, pertaining to the docked bike share program. And this is something some of you may not remember, because we haven't talked about this in some time. We have one. It's been in storage since just before the pandemic. Some of you I know are intimately familiar with the projects. Others of you might be reading about it for the first time. I need to let you know that after a lot of consideration, I do think it's time perhaps for us to, I don't want to say throw in the towel, but sort of acknowledge that this program probably isn't going to get back off the launch pad, and it's time to sort of cut our losses. We are incurring a regular storage cost for this equipment as it is, which I'll be honest with you, I think the need has kind of moved on. We have e-scooters and e-bikes that don't require docking. The private sector has stepped in and doesn't require a government subsidy. And I checked with our customer service agent a while back, officer, excuse me. And she sort of dug into how many public requests for the service have we received, and I think she struggled to find any. If we roll in, odds and ends we've heard and things on social media, I'd say it's less than 10 in probably 3 years. In the meantime, having spoken to our original partnering organizations, none of them seem to have a huge appetite for restoring the service as well. I think the moment has passed, and the future now lies with Spin and Bird and their like. So there is a policy pertaining to forbidding me from making material changes that could be foreseen to create, I think, significant resistance. To be honest with you, I don't believe there will be significant resistance to this. Nevertheless, I'm not to do that without affording an opportunity for public discussion of it. So I am going to have some sort of expedited public comment period on this decision. And I don't want to forejudge the sentiment there, but if it sort of leads towards continuing to wind it down, we will begin to do that. Simply because the system hasn't been running now for several years. I don't think there's a big customer base to alienate. We have received occasionally some interest from other parties who still operate this early generation of technology. We'll reach out to them to see if the equipment can still be usefully used in some other part of the country. So I just wanted to make sure that I bring that to your attention, let you know I'm having that conversation, just sort of winding that one down most likely. And then finally, employee engagement, coming after treatment of staff monitoring report some time ago and recent surveys. Happy to say HR is experimenting with different ways of engaging with staff. They're doing a lot of focus groups, and I got a very preliminary briefing the other day. The focus groups, I think, are going better than the anonymous survey. I think we have more participation in those focus groups from staff than we had respondents to the most recent survey. I think there's something about the human connection as opposed to the impersonal typing something. So we're very intrigued by this. Perhaps the focus of our reporting and future monitoring reports might shift to a more well-attended means of gathering their feedback. And it generally the sentiment is good. I'm giving HR more time to give me sort of a summary write-up, but it's heading in a very constructive direction that I'm very happy to see. So that's my report. I'm happy to answer any questions that the board may have.
Go ahead, Susan. You can see I did my homework. I actually read everything. First question has to do with the 4th Avenue and Blake Transit expansion projects. As part of the planning, are you working with the city and the DDA on how we will accommodate our patrons during the construction? So for instance, when 4th Avenue is under construction, is part of the work also strategies that will be implemented once the construction begins? Certainly more dramatic will be the construction of a building on the Y lot, but I'm just curious, as part of the planning for what I think will be a much more pedestrian-friendly street, there will be some pain during that construction. And so is planning happening for accommodating our patrons during that construction?
Sure. And I don't know, Deb, is Forrest still on the line? Let's bring him back because I think he may have more timely information than I do. So you have a construction policy that I think requires us to, sort of take the needs of patrons into consideration during construction and the disruption that occurs. With the Y lot, that project is moving slowly. I think it's probably premature to have detailed planning about logistics during construction. I just don't think we're there yet. I am not I know the 4th Avenue thing is moving more expeditiously, but I don't know exactly the timing. So Forrest is closer to the project. And so Forrest, the question was, has there been any discussion yet with regard to, and yes, we are working with the DDA and the city on that project, on the 4th Avenue work, I don't know what the status is. Have we gotten to a point yet where we would even be having conversations about relocation of bus bays during construction, or is that still in the future?
Still in the future. I think at this moment we focus on the design and I'm waiting for Y lot project decision, where we're going, the timeline. Certainly the maintaining existing operations during the construction is a big thing. We may have to relocate somewhere, or may have to phase in. If we can get a Y lot built first, that bus lane, and so maybe it was a minimum disruption, but we don't know yet. We're not in the construction, facing the construction stage yet. But that's a good question.
The reason I'm asking is that at least it was a casual conversation. I understood that 4th Avenue was moving quicker, and we won't have bays off street constructed by the time that construction happens. So I was curious if discussion had already started about how to implement that work and not affect our patrons any degree. But it sounds like you have that in hand.
Yeah, we've been thinking about that. Depending on how soon 4th Avenue construction is going to go forward, and then we'll have to develop a construction plan for maintaining our operations.
Okay, and then I have one other question, just it's during the CEO report, so I'll be quick. There was a discussion about how the university gave a presentation at the Transportation Commission about a potential traffic signal priority system that would include signal preemption for emergency vehicles and transit vehicles and so forth. And the report says that staff are consulting with them, but it's not necessarily affecting our own work. Can you give us a status report on our own signal prioritization or signal preemption project? I saw $600,000 in the '24 budget for that. So I was curious what the status of work is for our own work on this.
Forrest, do you want to
Yeah,
respond?
Sure. So we're in the process to procure a vendor, develop the solution. So all the RFP is almost ready to go. So we have a consultants helping us to develop the scope. I don't know how long it's going to take, because that's going to be, depending on who is on board. I think there has been some discussion. Hopefully we'll get some bid, the RFP going out pretty soon and the bid coming in so we can start that process. So it's going to take another year or 2 years to get the solution in place, because our solution is a little bit different than what university proposing. We're working in the backend office, try to talk to the signal system with the city and with the county, so they know if a bus is late, so they give a signal priority. If a bus is on time or bus is already early, so we probably don't need that signal timing change. But again, different operations may need different priority treatment. So along some BRT corridor, we may just get a signal priority all the time, but that depends on the different case.
Very good. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes, Jesse.
I wanted to thank Matt and the rest of the staff and for finally putting customer service reps at the YTC. I had the fortune to be able to spend a couple of hours there on the first day, August 1st. And by the time I had arrived in the afternoon, they had already made several transactions. And I don't know if people are aware of this, but prior to this, the only brick and mortar options for people in the Ypsilanti area to buy tokens or passes was to go to the Bank of Ann Arbor location, and that's not very well advertised, and they also don't accept credit card and bankers hours. So now we have 2 customer service reps there from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. on Monday through Friday. And it was just, if you've ever been in the YTC, you walk in and it was always this dark corner of the building. You might occasionally see like a security guard hanging out like in the shadows. It was this really unwelcoming dark. It really affected the whole lighting of the entire space. And walking in there with the glass, with the lights on, and these 2 people like smiling. They took calls. I saw they had the maps pulled up on their computer. They were helping people. They were just helping people use our service, and it was long overdue, but it was just so gratifying to see. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Jesse. Any other questions or comments for Mr. Carpenter? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and close out the CEO report. Thank you, Matt. And we'll move on to closing items, which is the action item recap. And that would be Mr. Carpenter and Ms. Holt.
Okay. So I think, Mike, were there any from the monitoring task force? Are there any action items there, or is it just continuing to work? Okay. Third quarter report tabled, sustainability policy approved. The policy manual will be updated to reflect this, and we'll make sure new copies get out. I want to ask everyone, and Deb, please check your versions. I was speaking with one of you the other day, and we realized an older version. Can't remember who it was, but we'll make sure you have the most recent one in whatever electronic or hard copy format you prefer. Dina has work still to do, but the first presentation of the draft budget seems to have been very well accepted. You had a number of good questions. I think we have received some other questions also today from some of you. We'll work to answer those questions. I do expect some of the numbers are still kind of shifting a little bit. So the final version that you see next month, I would imagine, will look very similar to this, but with a few minor tweaks. And I will note for you, I have a note to myself, next month is decision month. We need 6 affirmative votes for a budget, not a simple majority of those present. So attendance matters in September. Okay. For us continuing to work on Title VI, I'm continuing to accept comments on the business plan, but the direction, I think the actions move into the budget. And I think that's it in terms of action items, unless I've missed anything.
I have a few.
Oh, okay.
Kathleen is going to be sending a reminder, the Governance Procurement Task Force, they still need a member or two for that. A reminder that board elections are next month, and that'll actually be added for the topics for next month. And also there was a request, and we will send out, and it will also be included, we'll re-upload to our website and include the budget presentation, the draft budget presentation. So I'll get that sent to the board, and then that will be added to the packet that is on our website for board meetings.
Thank you, Deb. And one last thing, I would be remiss. An open invitation for any of our public speakers this evening who had concerns about what's going on at the Ypsilanti Transit Center and the Ypsilanti Police Department. Open invitation. Please reach out to us. There's a web form on our web page where you can reach out to the executive team. And I can speak to some people maybe directly this evening. Happy to have conversations there, happy to involve the relevant board members as well. Obviously, that's a concern we don't want to let just sit out there, and George and I probably need to make some phone calls to the Ypsilanti Police Chief, nip something in the bud. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. So our next board meeting is Thursday, September 21st, 2023. And as Matt alluded, the budget presentation is that evening, and we definitely need at least 6. Be nice if everyone could be here, all 8 of us. Our financial planning and budgeting will be coming out 2.4. Fair policy, please, that will be coming across your emails from Deb, 2.5. 1.2, and then we have our budget, I said budget presentation, and then quarterly 3 service report. So that now leads us to our public comment, and we do have people in the gallery. Is there anyone who'd like to speak here? Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to thank everybody for, it was encouraging to hear you're disheartened by the strange information going around. I look forward to getting feedback, report back on that, and developments with public comment on the redevelopment of the bus station. Thank you.
Thank you. Deb, is there anyone online who'd like to comment?
We have 2, Amber
Oh,
Fellows.
Rob, I thought you said no. Okay, all right, go ahead, Jim.
Amber, you're unmuted. Sorry about that.
Hi, yeah, Amber Fellows again. So I just want to thank the board and staff for responding tonight. That was nice to hear some answers right away. And I also thank you for sharing our concerns over the process issue. I do want to still say that it's not just the process issue. It is the that, I would say there's concern over any flirtation of the idea of having any enforcement agency have a substation at YDC. We know that the RIDE is not totally allergic to collaboration with the police because the Blake Transit Center has the APD substation nearby. So what I would like to see is for the board to put it on the agenda for next meeting to discuss this more thoroughly. And I would love to see your commitment to this by making a resolution to commit to not having a YPD substation or other enforcement agency substation. So just putting that out there, would like to see follow up from the board as well. And I'd love to talk to the staff. So thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to go next, Mr. Pulaski? Are you sure? Okay. Everybody's
right,
being
too.
so nice.
Jim Mogensen, you are unmuted.
All right. So two more things before I forget about the issue relating to the police. And that is we're going to have a new sheriff. And in the past, what has been floated is to have people from the sheriff's department riding the buses, particularly on the east side of the system, monitoring the public from the buses. And there are a variety of opinions on this, as you might imagine, but I think it's a good idea to keep that in mind as you're having this other conversation. You probably don't want to mix too many things together, but I'm just giving you that heads up. I'm just giving you that heads up that may become an issue in the future, and beginning the ties now to think through that is important. And I was once at the Ypsilanti Transit Center, and a security officer called the police on a young man who was waiting around outside, and he was interrogated in the waiting room at the Ypsilanti Transit Center, which was incredibly awkward for all of us who were waiting for the bus. So that's another situation to think through if on the planning to figure out what the protocol is relating to that and having that happen there. So let's talk about the BRT. So my main concern about the BRT, as we talked about at the last meeting, I think the MDOT planning people who are working on that issue live in the area. I think one of the planners lives in Ypsilanti. So I think that helped early on in having that the understanding that there needed to be that conversation about the bus service being able to make it through that and not have it too constricted. The other part of the constriction on the Washtenaw BRT is down by the Rock and down that section of Washtenaw. If you take a lane out, if you think people are upset about the bike lanes, which I can assure you, it's an amazing thing, but people are still complaining about the bike lanes downtown, right? Take away 2 lanes on Washtenaw, and the conversation, I believe, will escalate. So to keep that in mind, I am feeling that we will all have an enhanced BRT express service, but it may be a stretch to be able to do that. So hopefully I'll just throw that out there in terms of figuring out how that moves forward. And it's been a long meeting, so I'm sure I'll come back next meeting and have more to say. So thank you very much and appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you, Mr. Mogensen and Mr. Pulaski. Oh, is there another one?
We have one more, yep. Diana Gonzalez, and you are unmuted.
I just wanted to thank everyone for their responses. I was heartened by them. I was clearly to see the shock on your faces was heartening. Just of it, oh, okay, maybe this wasn't a fait accompli as the Ypsi police chief was making it seem, and I did feel like many of our concerns were heard. But and so I'm just very grateful for that. Also to hear about the Detroit line. Again, I think you should look into Olympia because they had a great Seattle Olympia bus line. And then, yeah, I do think to echo Jim's with the bikes, and I think having more bike lanes, I would be riding the bikes more and using systems like that also. But I just wanted to, I don't want to prolong the meeting, but I wanted to thank everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Deb, is there anyone else online?
There's no one else online.
Mr. Pulaski, thank you for your patience.
Well, that's something to definitely laugh about tonight. First off, I'd like to thank the marketing team for these. These are amazing, and I already called dibs that this is going in my truck once I leave here tonight. But most of all, I wanted to really comment about some of the transportation projects and some of the projects that are really, revitalizing the city. The US 23 project that will definitely alleviate congestion between Washtenaw Avenue and combining the city of Ann Arbor and the city of Pittsfield Township to be able to make it more efficient, reliable to travel between point A to point B, whether you're in a car or you're commuting on a bus. That's one thing that really strikes me very much. I know this has been a constant conversation between me and Forrest in public hearings, and you know as well as I do, Matt, this has also been a conversation amongst public hearings as well, that this is definitely needed, and we have the money and infrastructure to be able to invest in that, and I'm just so proud to see it. For someone that comes from a middle-class community with no talk of public transit, no bike lanes, nothing whatsoever, you know, I get a little jealous sometimes because I get sidewalks that are beaten up. My tires constantly go blowing out on the side of the road because of sidewalks that are not paved, invested, and constantly bleed with our city council president and our mayor that we need bike lanes. And the one conversation they always push off is, oh, that's just a waste of money. It's a safety hazard. How is it a safety hazard if it's actually alleviating traffic on the sidewalks when people are walking their dogs and actually going for a stroll in the morning on some of the Huron Valley sidewalks, streets, all across Ann Arbor? It's definitely a great investment, and we're taking a leap of faith here in our city to be able to invest in new technology, mobility, and investing not just in millennials, but Generation Z that kind of uses their cell phone for basically everything. That's why the scooters are so heavily used by our college students, and public transit is so heavily used by our Easy Fare app to be able to pay fares. And also the partnership with the Ann Arbor Street Fair. I can't thank you enough for working with the Street Fair to be able to not just promote, but also get the service out and meet those demands. Like I said at a few meetings ago, I met a family from Georgia actually coming up from Atlanta last year. And one of the things they said is for a small region like this, for tourism, college, education, you guys have the most outstanding public transit in all of the state of Michigan, and actually the Midwest, to be quite frank with you. If you had to compare Ann Arbor to Toledo, Toledo doesn't compare, even though I've done so much work. I want to thank the board just for all the amazing work, especially customer service, most of all. Latanya, you do amazing work in customer service to be able to meet the demands of the rider, meet the rider's demands, and also address the situation first on. It really means a lot. And, you know, for a system like this, for as much work as you guys put in and the money that you guys receive, it's absolutely amazing. I'm sorry I'm going on and telling you guys that you guys are the most amazing system in the world, but it really means a lot because us as the CAC have discussed highly of you guys, and which leads me into my CAC business. So last few board meetings, we have discussed appointing someone to be a liaison for our committee for information coming in from the system. That information will be deferred to our committee on the 28th. At the end of this month, we'll have our in-person meeting at the SEMCOG offices in Detroit off of Woodward Avenue. And one of the main topics of discussion is nominations. So people that we have in mind right now would be Jesse Miller, Kathleen Mozak, and Susan Pollier. Am I saying that right? Perfect. We have nominations, and we're also looking at alternatives, Kyra Sims, Simi Barr, and we're also looking for someone on staff as well. That leads you into you, Matt. We're also looking for people to really give us information because we have a lot of public members that are interested in transit, and we need to look at it long-term. Lastly, it was good to see you at the street fair last month. Really good conversation, but keep up the good work, and I look forward to speaking with you guys at my last meeting in September. Thank you.
Thank you. Deb, are we closed? Just wanted to make sure. Wonderful. I just wanted to thank the staff and the board and our public who are here not only online but in person for this evening's meeting, and I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn. That would be Susan, seconded by Simi. All in favor, please raise your hands. Wonderful, that passed unanimously. No surprise. Everyone have a wonderful evening and a good weekend.